Welcome, weary traveller, to a gentle chronicle of peace after storm, of lives rebuilt from the ashes of war, of love found in the quiet years that followed darkness. Tonight, let these whispered tales of familiar faces carry you toward dreams, as we explore what became of every soul who touched the wizarding world's greatest conflict. Close your eyes and drift into this tapestry of second chances, new beginnings, and the beautiful ordinariness that heroes earned through their extraordinary sacrifice. Rest now, as we unfold the stories of what came after the final battle. In the golden light of a world finally free from shadow, three young people who had carried the weight of destiny upon their shoulders discovered what it meant to live for themselves rather than for survival. Harry Potter, the boy who had lived to become the man who conquered, found that victory brought not the simple peace he had imagined, but the complex challenge of building a life worth the sacrifices made to preserve it. The scar that had connected him to Voldemort's soul grew quiet at last, leaving him to navigate a world where his fame preceded him but his future remained unwritten. The choice to forego his 7th year at Hogwarts was not made lightly, though perhaps it was inevitable for someone whose education had been conducted in the corridors of war rather than the halls of learning. While his classmates returned to essays and examinations, Harry walked into the oral training program that had been his dream since 5th year, when the path ahead had seemed impossibly distant and uncertain. The irony was not lost on him that he had spent years learning to defend against the dark arts through necessity, only to discover that formal training required unlearning some of the harsh lessons that survival had taught him. The Ministry of Magic that welcomed him was itself transformed, purged of corruption, and rebuilt under Kingsley Shacklebolt's steady leadership. Here, Harry found purpose that went beyond the simple satisfaction of catching dark wizards, though that remained central to his calling. Each case was an opportunity to protect others from experiencing the losses he had endured, to ensure that families remained whole where his had been shattered. The work was dangerous, demanding, and often thankless, but it felt like the natural continuation of a war that had ended in victory but left wounds that required careful tending. His partnership with Ron was both natural and challenging. Two young men whose friendship had been forged in crisis, now learning to work together in circumstances where disagreement meant more than hurt feelings but potentially compromised missions. Ron's tactical instincts were sharp, honed by years of chess playing and strategic thinking, but his emotional responses sometimes created complications that Harry's more controlled approach avoided. They learned to balance each other, Ron's warmth humanizing situations where Harry's intensity might have created distance, Harry's focus preventing Ron's occasional impulsiveness from escalating into disaster. The cases that defined Harry's early Auror career were not the dramatic confrontations that had marked his school years, but the patient, methodical work of rebuilding a justice system that had been corrupted by fear and prejudice. Death Eaters who had evaded capture during the war's chaos emerged from hiding, convinced that time had diminished the resolve of their pursuers. They discovered their error through encounters with an Auror whose understanding of dark magic was both theoretical and viscerally personal, who could recognize the signs of dark arts corruption through experience rather than textbook study. The promotion that made him the youngest head of the Auror office in ministry history came not through political favoritism, but through demonstrated competence that his colleagues couldn't ignore. At 26, Harry found himself responsible not just for his own cases, but for the careers and safety of witches and wizards whose experience exceeded his own. The transition from field operative to administrator required skills that Hogwarts had never taught. Lessons in diplomacy and resource management that were harder than any defense against the dark arts examination. His marriage to Ginny Weasley was perhaps the most normal thing in a life that had been defined by abnormality since his 11th birthday. Their courtship had been interrupted by war, their relationship tested by separation and danger, but the peace that followed allowed them to discover each other without the pressure of immediate peril. Ginny's independence and strength matched his own, her refusal to be defined by their relationship providing the foundation for a partnership between equals rather than protector and protected. The birth of their children marked chapters in Harry's life that he measured not by professional achievements, but by small domestic victories. James Sirius Potter inherited his father's unruly hair and his namesake's mischievous spirit, displaying magical signs early that suggested power, but also the kind of curiosity that would require careful guidance. Albus Severus Potter carried names that honored complex legacies, his quiet thoughtfulness suggesting depths that might match his father's capacity for both darkness and light. Lily Luna Potter brought joy that her father had never experienced in his own childhood, her laughter echoing through a house that knew love rather than neglect. The chocolate frog card that bore his image was both honor and burden, immortalizing achievements that Harry would have preferred to leave in the past. Children throughout the wizarding world collected his likeness alongside historical figures whose legends had grown comfortable with age, not understanding that the man they celebrated still woke some nights with memories of green light and cold laughter. But the card also represented something important, proof that heroism could be recognized without being commercialized, that sacrifice could be remembered without being trivialized. His occasional lectures at Hogwarts served dual purposes, providing students with insights that no textbook could offer, while allowing Harry to reconnect with the place that had been his first true home. Standing in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, he could see faces that reminded him of his younger self, eager and uncertain, unprepared for the realities that adult witches and wizards preferred not to discuss. His teaching style was practical rather than theoretical, emphasizing preparation and awareness over flashy spellwork, understanding that survival often depended more on recognition of danger than ability to respond to it once identified. The students who learned from him carried forward not just tactical knowledge but philosophical approaches to magic that had been shaped by war. They understood that power without wisdom was dangerous, that courage without compassion was meaningless, and that the greatest victories were often measured not by enemies defeated but by innocence protected. These lessons, passed from teacher to student in the ancient tradition of magical education, ensured that Harry's influence would extend far beyond his active career. Ron Weasley's journey into adulthood followed a path that was both parallel to and divergent from his best friend's trajectory. The decision to join the Auror program had been made partly from genuine calling but also from reluctance to be left behind while Harry pursued the career they had discussed since 5th year. The training revealed capabilities that Ron had always possessed, but had been overshadowed by the more dramatic talents of his companions. His ability to think tactically, to understand complex social dynamics, and to remain steady under pressure made him an effective partner and eventually a skilled investigator. But the work also revealed limitations that Ron was honest enough to acknowledge. The patience required for surveillance operations, the emotional control necessary for interrogations, and the political sensitivity demanded by high-profile cases were skills that he could develop, but never found natural. After 2 years of competent but not exceptional service, he recognized that his talents lay elsewhere, and that staying in a career that didn't truly suit him would serve neither himself nor the cause of justice. The decision to leave the Auror Corps and join George at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was viewed by some as retreat from important work to frivolous commerce. Ron understood the criticism, but rejected its premise, recognizing that bringing joy and laughter to a world that had seen too much sorrow was its own form of service. The joke shop had been Fred and George's dream, but it became Ron's mission to ensure that their vision survived and prospered in the peacetime they had died to secure. His partnership with George was complicated by grief that both brothers carried differently. Where George retreated into work as escape from loss, Ron approached it as connection to memory, finding ways to honor Fred's creativity while contributing his own ideas and perspectives. The products that emerged from their collaboration combined George's innovative magic with Ron's understanding of practical applications, creating joke items that were sophisticated enough to challenge adult wizards while remaining safe enough for Hogwarts students. The success of the business exceeded even Fred and George's optimistic projections, as a wizarding world emerging from war discovered appetite for humor that had been suppressed by years of fear and suspicion. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became more than retail establishment, but cultural institution, a place where laughter was not just permitted but encouraged, where the serious business of joy was conducted with professional dedication. His marriage to Hermione represented the culmination of a relationship that had developed through shared trials rather than romantic circumstances. Their courtship had been conducted in the spaces between crises, their understanding of each other built through observation of how they responded to pressure rather than how they behaved in comfortable situations. The foundation of mutual respect and complementary strengths proved more durable than passion might have been, creating partnership that could weather the challenges of building life together. Their children, Rose and Hugo, inherited the best qualities of both parents while developing personalities that were distinctly their own. Rose displayed her mother's intellectual curiosity combined with her father's loyalty and warmth, approaching problems with systematic analysis but never losing sight of the human elements involved. Hugo showed early signs of his father's tactical thinking, enhanced by his mother's attention to detail, suggesting that he would excel in whatever field eventually captured his interest. Ron's role as godfather to James Potter was taken seriously, understanding that it represented not just honor but responsibility to provide guidance and support that extended beyond his own family. The relationship developed naturally, based on genuine affection rather than obligation, as James found in Ron someone who understood both the benefits and burdens of growing up in the shadow of famous parents. The advice Ron offered was practical and honest, drawing from his own experience of learning to define himself separately from others' expectations. The chocolate frog card that eventually featured his likeness was, in his own words, the finest achievement of his life, not because the honor was undeserved, but because it represented recognition of worth that had nothing to do with being Harry Potter's friend or Hermione Granger's husband. The card commemorated his individual contributions to both the war effort and the peace that followed, acknowledging that heroism took many forms and that supporting others was as valuable as leading them. Hermione Granger's post-war journey began with a choice that defined her character as clearly as any decision she had made during the conflict itself. While her friends moved directly into careers and adult responsibilities, she chose to complete the education that war had interrupted, returning to Hogwarts for a 7th year that was both familiar and strange. The castle had been rebuilt, the scars of battle healed through magic and time, but the memories remained vivid for someone who had walked its corridors during the darkest nights of its history. The decision to finish her formal education was practical as well as philosophical. Hermione understood that the knowledge she would need for the career she envisioned could not be acquired solely through experience, that the theoretical foundations provided by complete magical education would enhance rather than limit her practical capabilities. She approached her studies with characteristic thoroughness, but also with perspective that her younger self had lacked, understanding how classroom learning connected to real-world applications. Her first priority upon graduation was personal rather than professional. The journey to Australia to find her parents and restore the memories she had modified to protect them during the war. The reunion was complicated by guilt and gratitude in equal measure, as they struggled to understand what she had done and why it had been necessary. The conversations that followed were difficult but healing, as they worked to rebuild relationships that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The career path she chose reflected both her intellectual capabilities and her moral commitments, beginning with the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, where she could continue the advocacy work that had begun with SPEW during her school years. The issues were complex and deeply rooted in centuries of prejudice and exploitation, but Hermione approached them with the same systematic determination that had characterized her academic work. Her efforts to improve conditions for house elves, goblins, and other magical beings required not just legal knowledge but political acumen, as she learned to navigate ministry bureaucracy and build coalitions with officials who might support reform for practical, if not ideological reasons. The progress was incremental rather than revolutionary, measured in small victories that gradually accumulated into meaningful change. The promotion to deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement represented recognition of her growing expertise in legal magic and her demonstrated ability to manage complex cases involving multiple departments and competing interests. Her focus on eliminating discriminatory laws required careful attention to precedent and procedure, ensuring that reforms would be legally sound and politically sustainable rather than dramatic but temporary. The work was often tedious and always challenging, as each changed law required extensive research, careful drafting, and patient negotiation with officials who might oppose reform on principle or self-interest. But Hermione found satisfaction in the knowledge that her efforts were creating a more just society, that future generations of magical beings would enjoy rights and protections that had been denied to their predecessors. Her eventual appointment as Minister of Magic, while occurring in sources of questionable canonicity, represented the logical culmination of a career dedicated to improving magical society through legal and political reform. Whether or not this specific achievement could be considered definitive, her influence on ministry policy and magical law was undeniable, creating precedents and institutions that would outlast any individual administration. The translation and publication of the Tales of Beedle the Bard represented a different kind of contribution to magical society, bringing scholarly rigor to beloved stories, while making Dumbledore's insights available to readers who could benefit from his wisdom. The project required not just linguistic skill but deep understanding of the cultural contexts that gave the tales their meaning, connecting ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. Her chocolate frog card was perhaps inevitable, given achievements that spanned multiple fields and contributed to both wartime victory and peacetime prosperity. But for Hermione, the recognition was less important than the knowledge that her work was making a difference, that each law changed and each barrier removed created opportunities for others to build better lives. The three friends who had been bound together by crisis discovered in peace that their friendship could survive success as well as adversity, that the bonds forged in war were strong enough to support the weight of separate lives and individual achievements. They remained connected not by dependency but by choice, understanding that the struggles they had shared had created relationships that were both unique and enduring. Their children would grow up in a world shaped by their parents' sacrifices but not defined by their parents' traumas, free to pursue their own dreams, because others had been willing to fight for that freedom. The legacy they left was not just in the specific achievements recorded on chocolate frog cards, but in the countless small decisions that created a society where such achievements were possible. In the quiet moments between public recognition and private satisfaction, they sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought them from frightened children hiding from evil to adults capable of shaping the world they inhabited. The transformation had been neither easy nor complete, as they continued to discover new aspects of themselves and new challenges that required growth and adaptation. But they faced these challenges with confidence earned through experience, understanding that they had already survived the worst that life could offer, and found in that survival not just personal strength but purpose that extended beyond themselves. The boy who lived, the loyal friend who supported him, and the brilliant witch who guided them both had become adults whose influence would ripple through generations, their example proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort and principle over convenience. The paths that love and dedication carve through time often lead to destinations that neither passion nor duty could have predicted. And, in the years that followed the fall of Voldemort, 3 souls who had discovered their true selves in the crucible of war found their lives taking shapes that honored both their individual natures and the connections they had forged with others. Ginny Weasley's journey from the girl who had been possessed by a memory to the woman who would capture hearts both on the Quidditch pitch and in the press box was marked by a fierce independence that war had taught her to value above all other qualities. Her relationship with Harry Potter had been tested by separation, strengthened by reunion, and ultimately proven through the simple choice to build something together, rather than merely surviving together. But Ginny understood, perhaps better than Harry himself initially did, that their partnership would only flourish if both brought complete selves to it rather than fragments shaped by trauma and expectation. Her decision to pursue professional Quidditch was not escape from their relationship but investment in it, ensuring that she would always know who she was outside of being Harry Potter's girlfriend, wife, and eventually the mother of his children. The Holyhead Harpies had been more than a childhood dream, but a symbol of excellence that demanded everything she could offer and more besides. The training regimen was brutal, designed to push players beyond what they thought possible and then demand additional improvement. Ginny discovered reserves of strength and determination that even the war had not required her to access, finding that competitive athletics could be as demanding as combat, but infinitely more joyful in its intensity. Her position as chaser required not just individual skill, but the ability to work seamlessly with teammates who brought their own ambitions and insecurities to every practice and match. The dynamics were complex, competitive spirits, learning to channel rivalry into collective achievement, personal glory subordinated to team success but never entirely eliminated. Ginny's leadership emerged naturally, not through appointment or announcement, but through the simple demonstration that she could be counted upon in crucial moments. The professional Quidditch circuit was a world unto itself, with traditions and politics that dated back centuries, rivalries that transcended individual players, and pressures that could destroy careers as easily as poor performance or injury. Media attention followed the sport obsessively, analyzing every decision and mistake with intensity that sometimes exceeded coverage of ministry politics. Players learned to navigate interviews and public appearances as part of their professional responsibilities, understanding that their words could influence team dynamics and fan loyalty as significantly as their performance on the pitch. Ginny's natural wit and refusal to be intimidated by journalists made her a media favorite, but she was careful to maintain boundaries that protected her private life and relationships from public scrutiny. The balance was delicate, requiring her to be engaging enough to fulfill promotional obligations, while revealing nothing that could be used to damage those she cared about. Her experience with unwanted attention during her school years had taught her the importance of controlling her own narrative rather than allowing others to define her through speculation and rumor. The decision to retire from professional Quidditch was not made lightly or suddenly, but represented a careful evaluation of priorities that had shifted as her relationship with Harry deepened, and their desire to start a family grew stronger. She understood that the career she was leaving behind might never be available again, that the window for elite athletic performance was narrow and unforgiving. But she also recognized that some opportunities were worth sacrificing for others, that the joy of raising children with someone she loved might exceed even the satisfaction of sporting achievement. Her transition to journalism was natural, drawing upon years of experience on both sides of media attention to provide coverage that was knowledgeable, insightful, and fair. The Daily Prophet, rebuilding its reputation after years of political manipulation and unreliable reporting, needed correspondents who understood the subjects they covered and could be trusted to report accurately rather than sensationally. Ginny's combination of sporting expertise and writing talent made her invaluable for coverage that went beyond simple match reporting to examine the cultural and social aspects of magical athletics. The 2014 Quidditch World Cup represented the pinnacle of her new career, an assignment that allowed her to combine her passion for the sport with her growing skills as a journalist. The tournament brought together the finest players from around the world, each match a demonstration of tactical brilliance and individual artistry that demanded coverage worthy of the spectacle being presented. Ginny's reports captured not just the action on the pitch, but the human stories behind it, the dreams and disappointments that gave meaning to victory and defeat. Her coverage of Rita Skeeter's disruptive presence at the tournament demonstrated how her journalistic integrity had been shaped by personal experience with unfair reporting. When Skeeter's articles created conflicts between players and managers through deliberate misrepresentation and inflammatory speculation, Ginny's corrections were swift, factual, and devastating in their precision. Her confrontation with the notorious reporter during the final match was conducted with professional calm that made Skeeter's eventual illness seem almost anticlimactic, justice served through superior preparation rather than dramatic gesture. The children she and Harry welcomed into the world inherited not just their parents' magical abilities, but their complex legacies, names that carried weight from history, and expectations that would shape their development in ways both subtle and profound. James Sirius Potter arrived first, displaying from earliest childhood the mischievous energy that his namesakes had been famous for, but also a warmth and loyalty that reflected his parents' influences. His magic manifested early and dramatically, suggesting power that would require careful guidance to channel constructively rather than destructively. Albus Severus Potter carried names that honored complicated men whose actions had shaped his parents' lives in fundamental ways, a burden and responsibility that would influence his development as he grew old enough to understand the histories he had been asked to represent. His temperament was more thoughtful than his older brothers, suggesting depth that might match the complexity of his inheritance. The conversations he would eventually have with his father about the men whose names he bore would be among the most important of both their lives. Lily Luna Potter brought light to a family that had known too much darkness, her laughter echoing through rooms that had been empty too long, and hearts that had forgotten how to be fully joyful. Her namesakes represented different forms of love and loyalty, maternal sacrifice and unwavering friendship, qualities that seemed to manifest in her personality from earliest childhood. She possessed a confidence that came from being completely secure in her parents' love, free to explore and experiment without fear of abandonment or disapproval. The household they created together was consciously different from either of their childhood experiences, designed to provide security without restriction, structure without rigidity, guidance without control. Harry's memories of the Dursleys' home influenced every decision about discipline and encouragement, while Ginny's experience in the warm chaos of the Burrow shaped their approach to family dynamics and sibling relationships. They worked to create an environment where their children could develop their individual personalities while understanding their responsibilities to each other and the wider world. The balance between Harry's public responsibilities and their family's privacy required constant attention and occasional sacrifice, as media interest in the boy who lived extended naturally to his wife and children. Ginny's experience with unwanted attention proved invaluable in helping their children understand how to navigate public interest without allowing it to define their self-worth or restrict their choices. They learned early that fame was something that happened to them rather than something they were, a distinction that would serve them well as they grew older. The extended Weasley family gatherings that marked holidays and special occasions provided their children with a sense of belonging to something larger than their immediate family, connections to cousins and relatives who shared their unusual position as children of war heroes. These relationships would prove crucial as they grew older and began to understand the unique challenges and opportunities that their parentage created. They learned that they were part of a network of mutual support and shared responsibility that extended far beyond blood relationships. Neville Longbottom's transformation from the frightened child who had lost his remembrall to the young man who had destroyed Nagini with Gryffindor's sword continued in peacetime, as he discovered that courage once found could be cultivated and strengthened through practice and application. His brief career as an Auror was undertaken from sense of duty rather than calling, understanding that his skills and experience from the war could serve the cause of justice even if his heart lay elsewhere. The work was challenging and meaningful, but it also required him to maintain the state of constant alertness and readiness for violence that had characterized his final years at Hogwarts. He discovered that he preferred the peace that came with teaching and nurturing growth to the tension that accompanied hunting dark wizards and preventing criminal activity. The choice to leave the Auror Corps was made without regret, understanding that different forms of service were needed to build the peaceful world that the war had been fought to secure. His return to Hogwarts as a professor represented homecoming in the deepest sense, as the castle that had witnessed his growth from frightened child to confident young man welcomed him back as a colleague and guardian of future generations. The herbology department, under Professor Sprout's guidance, had been his refuge during his most difficult years, providing sanctuary where his natural talents could flourish without the pressure and competition that marked other subjects. His relationship with Professor Sprout evolved from student and teacher to colleagues, and eventually to the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. She had seen his potential when others, including himself, had dismissed it, nurturing his abilities with patience and wisdom that he was determined to pass on to his own students. The greenhouses became his domain gradually, each season bringing new responsibilities and opportunities to shape young minds through connection with growing things. His teaching style was patient and encouraging, informed by his own experience of being dismissed and underestimated by those who should have recognized his worth. He understood that confidence in magical ability often came slowly and through small successes rather than dramatic breakthroughs, that students needed permission to fail and try again without judgment or ridicule. His classes became known for their supportive atmosphere as much as their academic rigor. The DA coin that he sometimes showed to interested students had become more than mere artifact but symbol of the principle that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they supported each other and refused to accept limitations imposed by fear or authority. The stories he told about those days were carefully chosen, emphasizing the importance of preparation, practice, and mutual support, while avoiding the traumatic details that would have been inappropriate for his young audience. His appointment as head of Gryffindor House was recognition not just of his personal growth, but of his embodiment of the house's values in their purest form. He had learned courage not through natural fearlessness, but through choosing to act despite terror, a form of bravery that was perhaps more admirable than instinctive boldness. His guidance of Gryffindor students was informed by understanding that true courage required wisdom to distinguish between necessary risks and foolish bravado. His marriage to Hannah Abbott represented the quiet happiness that follows drama, two people who had shared experiences of loss and growth, finding in each other the companionship and understanding that made ordinary life extraordinary. Hannah's career managing the Leaky Cauldron provided them with a home that was also a business, their apartment above the pub becoming a gathering place for friends and colleagues who appreciated both the privacy and the convenience of their location. Their decision not to have children was made jointly and without regret, understanding that there were many ways to influence the next generation, and that their energy and love could be channeled into teaching, community service, and support of their friends' families. Neville's role as godfather to Albus Potter was taken seriously, providing guidance and support that complemented rather than competed with Harry and Ginny's parenting. The gardens he maintained at Hogwarts became legendary among students and visitors, demonstrations of what magical cultivation could achieve when knowledge was combined with patience and genuine care for living things. Each season brought new experiments and discoveries, contributing to the broader understanding of magical botany while providing practical applications for healing, protection, and enhancement of daily life. His occasional lectures on defensive applications of herbology drew upon knowledge gained during the war years, when knowing which plants could heal wounds quickly or provide protection against dark magic had meant the difference between survival and death. These lessons were popular among students who understood that magic was most powerful when different disciplines were combined creatively and purposefully. Luna Lovegood's journey after the war followed paths that others considered eccentric, but which led her exactly where her unique vision and gentle wisdom were most needed. Her career as a magical naturalist was the perfect expression of her combination of intellectual curiosity, emotional openness, and complete lack of concern for conventional expectations or social approval. The world was full of wonders that others dismissed as impossible or irrelevant, and Luna was determined to document and understand as many of them as possible. Her travels took her to remote corners of the magical world where few witches or wizards ventured, places where ancient magic still flowed according to patterns that predated human understanding, and creatures lived according to rhythms that connected them to forces larger than individual existence. She approached each expedition with the same openness that had characterized her childhood observations of the world around her, recording not just what she saw, but what she felt and intuited about the relationships between different forms of magical life. The species she discovered and classified filled gaps in magical understanding that had existed for centuries. Creatures whose existence had been dismissed as legend or whose habits had been misunderstood by observers who approached them with predetermined assumptions about what was possible or likely. Her documentation was meticulous but never cold, capturing not just physical characteristics and behavioral patterns, but the emotional and spiritual qualities that gave each creature its unique place in the magical ecosystem. Her relationship with Rolf Scamander developed naturally through shared passion for magical creatures and mutual recognition of kindred spirits who valued truth over convention and wonder over skepticism. Their courtship was conducted in field conditions that tested compatibility more thoroughly than any formal social interaction could have done, as they learned to work together under challenging circumstances while maintaining respect for each other's methods and perspectives. Rolf's grandfather, Newt Scamander, had been legend in the field of magical creature research, but Rolf had earned his own reputation through careful observation and patient documentation that built upon his grandfather's foundation, while extending understanding into new areas and applications. His collaboration with Luna created a partnership that combined his systematic approach with her intuitive insights, producing research that advanced the field significantly while maintaining the sense of wonder that made the work meaningful rather than merely academic. Their marriage was celebration of shared purpose as much as mutual affection, a joining of two people whose life's work complemented and enhanced each other's abilities and interests. The ceremony was held outdoors, surrounded by the creatures they studied and the landscapes they loved, with friends and family who understood that this union represented not just personal happiness, but professional partnership that would benefit the entire magical world. The twins they eventually welcomed, Lorcan and Lysander, were born into a household where curiosity was encouraged above conformity and where questions were valued more highly than predetermined answers. Their childhood was spent among creatures that most wizarding children knew only from textbooks, if at all, giving them perspectives on magical life that would shape their own future choices and contributions to the world. Luna's continued search for the crumplehorn snorkack became something of a running joke among her colleagues, but it also represented something deeper about her approach to life and learning. The creature that her father had been convinced existed might indeed be mythical, but the search for it had led to discoveries that were undeniably real and valuable. The journey was as important as the destination, and the willingness to pursue possibilities that others dismissed was exactly the quality that made breakthrough discoveries possible. Her articles for the Quibbler evolved from the whimsical observations of childhood to serious contributions to magical natural history, though they retained the sense of wonder and possibility that had always characterized her writing. The magazine itself gained respectability, as Luna's discoveries validated her father's faith in unconventional thinking and open-minded investigation. What had once been dismissed as eccentric became recognized as pioneering, a shift that reflected broader changes in the magical world's willingness to question established assumptions. The impact of her work extended beyond academic circles to influence practical applications of magical creature knowledge in healing, agriculture, and environmental protection. The connections she documented between different species and their magical properties led to innovations in potion making and spellcrafting that improved life for witches and wizards throughout the world. Her insistence that all magical life deserved respect and protection also influenced policy discussions about creature rights and habitat preservation. Her friendship with Harry, Ron, and Hermione deepened over the years as they learned to appreciate the wisdom that had always been present in her seemingly scattered observations and unconventional conclusions. The loyalty she had shown during their darkest hours was matched by the joy she brought to their peaceful years. Her presence at family gatherings and celebrations, adding a perspective that kept them grounded in wonder even as their responsibilities grew heavier and more complex. The children of their extended friend group grew up thinking of Luna as an honorary aunt whose visits always brought stories of amazing adventures and discoveries that expanded their understanding of what was possible in the magical world. Her influence on their development was subtle but profound, teaching them to question assumptions, remain open to possibilities, and approach the unknown with curiosity rather than fear. The three paths that led away from war toward peace had required different forms of courage and determination, but they had also demonstrated that healing and growth could take many forms. Ginny's combination of athletic excellence and journalistic integrity created opportunities for others while building the family she had dreamed of creating. Neville's transformation from frightened boy to confident teacher showed that personal growth could continue throughout life when supported by purpose and community. Luna's adventures in magical natural history expanded understanding of the world while maintaining the wonder that made exploration meaningful. Together, their stories illustrated that the peace won through sacrifice could be used wisely, that the freedom purchased with blood could be invested in building better lives, not just for themselves, but for future generations who would inherit the world their courage had helped to create. The children who played together at family gatherings were growing up in a world where their parents' friendships provided models for loyalty, support, and mutual respect that would shape their own relationships and choices. The love that had sustained them through war continued to enrich their lives in peace, but it had evolved from the desperate clinging of people facing death together to the generous sharing of people who had learned that happiness was not diminished by being given away, but multiplied by being offered freely. They had discovered that the bonds forged in crisis could be strengthened by celebration, that friendship could survive success as well as failure, and that the deepest joy came from watching those you cared about find their own paths to fulfillment and purpose. The threads of redemption and consequence weave complex patterns in the aftermath of war, creating tapestries where former enemies must learn to coexist with those they once sought to destroy, where justice must be balanced against mercy, and where the children of both heroes and villains must find their own paths forward through the shadows cast by their parents' choices. In this delicate reconstruction of a world torn apart by hatred and fear, some souls discovered the possibility of transformation, while others remained trapped by the very prejudices that had led them into darkness. Draco Malfoy stood among the ruins of everything his family had believed in, watching the world they had tried to reshape crumble into dust and memory. The beliefs that had been passed down through generations of pure blood supremacy, the certainties that had guided his childhood and shaped his adolescent choices, lay shattered around him like broken glass that cut anyone who tried to gather the pieces. The young man who had once worn his family's prejudices like armor found himself naked and uncertain, forced to confront the possibility that everything he had been taught was not just wrong but morally reprehensible. The reconciliation with Harry Potter was neither dramatic nor complete, but it represented acknowledgement that the schoolboy rivalries that had once seemed so important were trivial compared to the larger questions of how civilized people should treat each other. They would never be friends in any meaningful sense, their personalities and experiences too different to bridge completely, but they learned to treat each other with the basic respect that adults owed to those who had survived similar trials and emerged with their essential humanity intact. The process of rebuilding his life required Draco to examine every assumption he had carried from childhood, questioning beliefs that had never been challenged because they had been presented as natural law rather than cultural choice. The revelation that Muggle-born wizards were not inferior, but often superior in ability and character to pure-bloods who claimed genetic supremacy, forced him to confront the possibility that his family's entire worldview was founded on lies designed to justify privilege and cruelty. His marriage to Astoria Greengrass represented more than romantic attachment, but conscious choice to build something new, rather than merely reconstructing what had been destroyed. Astoria came from a pure-blood family, but had rejected the prejudices that such lineage traditionally carried, her views on blood, purity, and magical equality shaped by observation and reasoning rather than inherited assumption. She represented the possibility of maintaining traditional magical culture while abandoning the hatred and exclusion that had corrupted it. Their courtship was conducted under the watchful eyes of both families, the Malfoys hoping that Astoria's pure blood status might restore some of their lost respectability while privately worrying about her progressive ideas. The Greengrasses uncertain whether association with the disgraced Malfoy name would damage their own social standing. The couple navigated these pressures with careful diplomacy, understanding that their marriage would be scrutinized as a symbol of either redemption or continued decline. The birth of their son, Scorpius, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Malfoy family history, an opportunity to raise a child according to principles based on evidence and compassion rather than prejudice and fear. Draco approached fatherhood with conscious determination to be different from his own father, to provide guidance that encouraged independent thinking rather than demanding unquestioning obedience to family tradition. The child they raised was taught from earliest age that a person's worth was determined by their actions and character rather than their ancestry or magical ability. Scorpius learned that Muggle-born wizards deserved the same respect as pure-bloods, that magical creatures had their own forms of intelligence and dignity, and that the power to cast magic carried responsibilities to use it wisely and compassionately. These lessons created tension with his grandparents that would define family gatherings for years to come. Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy watched their son's transformation with mixture of relief and horror, grateful that he had survived the war, but appalled by the values he was instilling in their grandson. Their own narrow escape from Azkaban had been purchased through cooperation with ministry authorities, and the testimony that Narcissa's lie to Voldemort had saved Harry Potter's life, but it had not changed their fundamental beliefs about magical hierarchy and pure blood superiority. The family dinners that followed became exercises in careful diplomacy, with 3 generations holding vastly different views about how magical society should be organized and what values should guide individual behavior. Scorpius learned early that adults could disagree profoundly about important matters while still maintaining family relationships, though the tension was often thick enough to cut with a knife, and conversations required constant navigation around subjects that might trigger arguments. Astoria's illness and early death represented tragedy that struck the family when Scorpius was only 13, old enough to understand loss, but too young to process its full implications for his future. The disease that claimed her was one that magical healing could slow but not cure, a gradual weakening that gave the family time to say goodbye, while making that farewell no less painful for its anticipated nature. Draco's grief was complicated by guilt, wondering whether stress from family conflicts had contributed to her condition, whether his past had somehow cursed their future together, whether he was capable of raising their son alone without the moderating influence of her wisdom and compassion. The responsibility of single parenthood forced him to grow in ways that partnership had not required, learning to be both father and mother to a boy who needed guidance through the complex social dynamics of magical adolescence. The inheritance of Malfoy Manor and the family fortune came with obligations as well as privileges, as Draco found himself responsible for maintaining properties and investments that had been built on foundations he now rejected. The challenge was to use inherited wealth in ways that honored his new values while providing security for his son, transforming resources that had been hoarded for exclusive family benefit into tools for broader social good. His donations to organizations that supported Muggle-born rights and magical creature welfare were made quietly, without publicity that might have been seen as attempts to purchase reputation or social acceptance. The goal was not recognition but results, using privilege that had been inherited through accident of birth to advance causes that his younger self would have opposed. But his mature conscience demanded he support. Kingsley Shacklebolt's ascension to the position of Minister for Magic represented the kind of leadership that the wizarding world desperately needed in the aftermath of war. Someone whose integrity was unquestionable and whose vision extended beyond the narrow interests of any particular faction or social group. His career had been built on merit rather than political connections. His reputation earned through competent service rather than inherited status. His authority derived from respect rather than fear. The ministry he inherited was deeply corrupted, its procedures twisted to serve Voldemort's agenda while maintaining facades of legitimacy that had fooled no one but had provided convenient excuses for those who preferred collaboration to resistance. The task of rebuilding required not just changing personnel, but reforming systems, replacing processes that had been designed to exclude and oppress with new approaches that emphasized fairness and effectiveness. His decision to ban Dementors from guard duty at Azkaban was among his first major reforms, understanding that creatures who fed on human happiness and hope had no place in any system that claimed to serve justice. The psychological torture that Dementors inflicted on prisoners went far beyond appropriate punishment, creating conditions that drove people insane, rather than encouraging rehabilitation or deterring future crime. The search for alternative security measures led to innovations in magical containment that were more humane, while being equally effective at preventing escape. The new systems required more resources and careful maintenance, but they reflected values that a civilized society should embrace, rather than the expedient cruelty that had characterized previous approaches to criminal justice. His efforts to eliminate corruption throughout the ministry required careful investigation of officials whose loyalty during the war had been questionable, but he approached this task with fairness that distinguished between those who had actively supported Voldemort's agenda and those who had simply tried to keep their heads down and survive. The goal was justice rather than revenge, accountability rather than persecution. The reforms he implemented created opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than family connections or political allegiance, opening positions to qualified candidates, regardless of their blood status or social background. The ministry that emerged from his administration was more diverse, more competent, and more responsive to the needs of all magical citizens, rather than just those with traditional power and influence. His working relationship with Hermione Granger proved crucial to many of his most important initiatives, as her legal expertise and systematic approach to policy analysis provided the foundation for lasting reforms rather than temporary changes that might be reversed by future administrations. Together, they created institutional structures that would survive political transitions and continue to serve the cause of equality and justice. The Dursley family's post-war experience illustrated how ordinary people processed extraordinary events, how lives that had been disrupted by magic gradually returned to patterns that felt normal and comfortable. Dudley Dursley's transformation from the spoiled bully who had tormented his cousin to a man capable of acknowledging his past mistakes and making amends represented the kind of personal growth that was possible when circumstances forced honest self-examination. His marriage and eventual fatherhood provided him with perspectives that his own childhood had not offered, understanding what it meant to want the best for children who depended on him for protection and guidance. The experience of raising his own son and daughter made him realize how his parents had failed in their responsibilities toward Harry, how fear and prejudice had led them to treat a vulnerable child with cruelty that no circumstances could justify. The relationship he maintained with Harry was awkward but genuine, based on mutual recognition that they were different people than they had been as children, and that the past, while not forgotten, need not define their future interactions. Their conversations were stilted and their meetings infrequent, but the Christmas cards they exchanged and the occasional family gatherings they endured represented acknowledgement that family bonds, however strained, carried obligations that decent people honored. The children who played together during these visits were largely oblivious to the complicated history that made adult conversations so difficult, seeing only cousins and relatives who lived different kinds of lives but shared basic humanity. Their innocence provided hope that future generations might be free from the prejudices and fears that had divided their parents, able to build relationships based on present reality rather than past grievances. Petunia Dursley's death around the year 2020 marked the end of an era. As the last person who remembered Lily Evans as a sister rather than a symbol passed away, her final act of leaving Harry the blanket he had been wrapped in as a baby suggested that some part of her had always known that her treatment of her nephew was wrong, that love and duty had been sacrificed to fear and resentment in ways that she regretted, but had never found the courage to acknowledge openly. The blanket itself was more than mere fabric but connection to the mother who had died to save him. intangible link to love that had protected him through his darkest hours and continued to influence his choices as an adult. The gesture of leaving it to him represented Petunia's recognition that Harry was the rightful keeper of his mother's memory, the person who had earned the right to inherit whatever remained of Lily's physical presence in the world. Vernon Dursley's continued existence as a widower was marked by stubborn refusal to admit that his worldview had been wrong, that his treatment of his nephew had been inexcusable. That fear of the magical world had led him to behavior that was both cruel and stupid. His inability to change or grow represented the tragedy of people who would rather cling to familiar prejudices than acknowledge uncomfortable truths about their own choices and character. The grandchildren he doted upon would grow up knowing that they had an uncle who was famous in a world their grandfather refused to acknowledge, a contradiction that would influence their development in ways that Vernon could not control or predict. The truth had a way of emerging despite attempts to suppress it, and children were often more capable of accepting wonder than adults who had convinced themselves that mystery was dangerous. The patterns of redemption and consequence that played out in the years following Voldemort's defeat demonstrated that victory in war was only the beginning of the longer struggle to build just and peaceful society. Some people proved capable of growth and change, while others remained trapped by the very attitudes that had led them into conflict in the first place. The children born into this mixed inheritance would have to navigate the tensions between past and future, learning to honor the sacrifices that had purchased their freedom, while refusing to be defined by conflicts they had not chosen. The forgiveness that healing required was neither automatic nor complete, but it was possible for those who were willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to repair the damage they had caused. The justice that peace demanded had to be balanced against mercy, punishment tempered by recognition that people could change if given opportunity and motivation to do so. The world that emerged from these struggles was neither perfect nor final, but it was better than what had come before, more inclusive and fair than previous versions of magical society had achieved. The progress was incremental and sometimes fragile, but it was real and meaningful for those who benefited from expanded opportunities and increased respect for their dignity and rights. The children who would inherit this improved world carried both its possibilities and its remaining problems. But they also carried the examples of adults who had chosen to be better than their circumstances required, who had found in forgiveness and growth the keys to building lives worth living and societies worth preserving. The dance between redemption and consequence would continue, but the music had changed to rhythms that emphasized hope rather than fear, inclusion rather than exclusion, love rather than hatred. The bonds that hold families together are tested most severely, not by external threats, but by the internal struggles that come when love must coexist with grief, when tradition must adapt to changed circumstances, and when the survivors of tragedy must find ways to honor the dead while building lives worth living for themselves and the generations that follow. In the sprawling network of relationships that connected the Weasley family to the wider wizarding world, these challenges played out with particular intensity, as each member sought to process loss while contributing to the collective healing that their extended community desperately needed. George Weasley faced each morning with the conscious effort required to remember that he was singular rather than plural, that the reflection in mirrors showed only one face where two had always appeared before, that conversations now required him to speak for himself alone, rather than as half of a partnership that had defined his identity since before birth. The absence of Fred was not merely emotional but physical, a phantom limb that ached with every breath and reminded him constantly that the world had become fundamentally different in ways that could never be corrected or accepted completely. The joke shop that had been their shared dream continued to operate, but its success felt hollow, without the person who should have been there to share both the triumph and the daily satisfaction of bringing laughter to a world that had forgotten how to smile. Every customer who entered Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was a reminder of what Fred would never see. Every successful product launched a celebration that felt incomplete without the person who had contributed equally to its creation. The decision to continue the business, rather than selling it or closing it permanently, was made not from business sense, but from desperate need to maintain connection with his brother's memory and vision. The shop represented more than commercial enterprise, but monument to creativity and joy, proof that some things were too important to be destroyed by war or diminished by loss. Working there daily was both torture and therapy, painful reminder of absence, but also affirmation that Fred's influence on the world could continue even after his physical presence had ended. Ron's assistance during the most difficult months was crucial, but also complicated, as George struggled to accept help while maintaining the independence that had always characterized his approach to both business and life. The balance was delicate, requiring Ron to be supportive without being controlling, helpful without being patronizing, present without being overwhelming. They learned to work together in ways that honored Fred's memory, while acknowledging that George's needs had changed fundamentally and permanently. The relationship with Angelina Johnson developed slowly and carefully, both of them understanding that their connection was built on shared grief as much as mutual attraction, that their love for Fred would always be part of whatever they built together. The progression from friendship through mourning to romance and eventually marriage required constant navigation of complex emotions and careful attention to boundaries that honored the past while allowing for future happiness. Their wedding was celebration tempered by awareness of absence, joy shadowed by knowledge that the person who should have been best man would never stand beside George again for any occasion. The ceremony itself was beautiful and meaningful, but it was also marked by empty chairs and unspoken acknowledgements that some losses could never be filled, only accommodated within new arrangements that made life possible, if not complete. Their children, Roxanne and Fred II, inherited a family history marked by heroism and tragedy in equal measure, growing up with stories of an uncle whose legend grew larger with each telling, but whose physical presence was known only through photographs and family memories. Fred II carried his namesake's memory with particular weight, understanding from early age that he represented continuation rather than replacement, that his life was tribute to someone whose potential had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The success of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in the post-war years exceeded even the twins' most optimistic projections, as a wizarding world emerging from darkness discovered enormous appetite for products that brought levity and laughter to daily life. The puking pastilles that had once been schoolboy pranks became workplace essentials for employees who needed legitimate excuses to leave meetings or avoid unpleasant tasks. The whizzing worms and fanged frisbees found markets among adults who had rediscovered play as an essential component of psychological health. The expansion of the business required George to develop skills that had never been necessary when creative partnership could handle all aspects of product development and marketing. He learned to manage employees, negotiate contracts, and plan inventory with attention to detail that Fred might have found tedious, but which George discovered could be its own form of meditation, routine tasks that occupied his mind, while allowing deeper healing to proceed at subconscious levels. The international success that followed domestic expansion brought opportunities to share British magical humour with wizarding communities throughout the world, but it also created responsibilities that George had never anticipated: licensing agreements and quality control, international shipping, and cultural adaptation of products required business acumen that had to be learned through experience and occasionally painful mistakes. Percy Weasley's return to the family fold was marked by careful rebuilding of relationships that had been damaged by years of political disagreement and personal pride, his reconciliation with his parents and siblings requiring acknowledgement of mistakes on all sides, and conscious commitment to prioritizing family bonds over political differences. The process was neither quick nor complete, as trust that had been broken needed time to heal, and wounds that had been inflicted through harsh words and stubborn positions required patient attention. His career advancement within the ministry reflected both his natural administrative abilities and his determination to prove that his earlier mistakes had been aberrations rather than character defects, that his fundamental commitment to public service could be separated from the poor judgment he had shown in supporting Fudge's administration. The work he threw himself into was demanding and often thankless, but it provided both professional satisfaction and personal redemption. The position as head of the Department of Magical Transportation suited his methodical approach to complex problems and his talent for coordinating multiple systems that needed to work together seamlessly. The flu network, apparition testing, portkey regulation, and various forms of magical transit required oversight that balanced safety concerns with practical accessibility, ensuring that witches and wizards could travel efficiently while preventing accidents or misuse by those with criminal intentions. His marriage to Audrey represented a fresh start with someone who had not known him during his most difficult years, who could see him as he was, rather than as he had been when pride and ambition had clouded his judgment about what truly mattered. Their relationship developed naturally through shared work at the ministry, professional respect evolving into personal affection that was grounded in mutual understanding of each other's values and goals. Their daughters, Molly and Lucy, brought joy to a man who had nearly lost his family through his own stubbornness and political blindness. Fatherhood taught him lessons about priorities that his earlier career focus had prevented him from learning, understanding that success in public life meant nothing if it came at the cost of relationships with those who mattered most. The children who grew up knowing their grandfather's warmth and their father's dedication saw no contradiction between public service and family loyalty. The reconciliation with his family was tested and strengthened by shared grief over Fred's death, as tragedy reminded everyone that disagreements about politics or career choices were trivial compared to the bonds of blood and shared history. Percy's presence at family gatherings gradually shifted from awkward obligation to genuine participation, his contributions to conversations and celebrations reflecting his understanding that being right about policy matters was less important than being present for people who needed his support. Arthur Weasley's transition from wartime fugitive back to respected ministry employee was marked by promotion that recognized both his expertise in Muggle affairs and his demonstrated loyalty during the darkest period in recent wizarding history. His fascination with non-magical technology and culture, which had once been viewed as eccentric hobby, unsuited to serious wizard, was suddenly valued as essential knowledge for a ministry that needed to understand and interact with the Muggle world more effectively. The position as head of the Department for Magical Law Enforcement was both honor and enormous responsibility, requiring him to oversee the reconstruction of systems that had been corrupted by Death Eater influence, while ensuring that justice was administered fairly to all citizens regardless of their wartime affiliations. The work was complex and sometimes controversial, as he navigated the delicate balance between punishment for genuine crimes and reconciliation with those who had been coerced or misled. His approach to leadership was characterized by fairness and patience, understanding that lasting change in institutional culture required persistent effort rather than dramatic gestures. The Aurora Department, the Magical Accidents and Catastrophes Department, and various enforcement agencies needed coordination and reform that respected their individual functions while ensuring that they worked together toward common goals of public safety and social justice. The joy he found in his expanding family was evident to everyone who knew him, as each new grandchild brought fresh wonder and renewed purpose to a man whose own children had given him enormous pride and occasional worry throughout their adventurous lives. The 12 grandchildren who eventually blessed the family represented hope for the future and validation that the sacrifices made during the war had been worthwhile. Molly Weasley's role as matriarch of an extended family that included not just her biological descendants but the chosen family members who had been welcomed into their circle required organizational skills that surpassed even her legendary ability to manage the chaos of the burrow during her children's school years. The holiday gatherings and family celebrations that she orchestrated became legendary among their friends and associates. Demonstrations of love expressed through food, hospitality, and careful attention to everyone's needs and preferences. The 7 granddaughters and 5 grandsons who called her Grandmum Molly inherited her fierce protectiveness and warm generosity, learning through her example that family bonds were strengthened through service to each other and that love was best expressed through actions rather than words. Her influence on their development was profound and lasting, teaching them values that would guide their own choices as they grew into adults with their own families and responsibilities. Her grief over Fred's death was processed partly through increased devotion to the living members of her family, ensuring that no opportunity for connection or celebration was missed, that every gathering was marked by conscious gratitude for those who remained, rather than dwelling on those who had been lost. The empty chair at family dinners was acknowledged, but not allowed to overshadow the joy found in those who continued to share meals and memories together. The letters she wrote to family members who lived far away were masterpieces of family news and gentle guidance, keeping everyone connected to the larger network of relationships that provided stability and support during both ordinary difficulties and extraordinary challenges. Her correspondence with Luna, Harry, and Hermione ensured that chosen family members remained integrated into the biological family's ongoing story, their achievements and struggles shared and celebrated as if they were blood relatives. Charlie Weasley's continued work with dragons in Romania represented the fulfillment of childhood passion that had never wavered despite the dangers and isolation that such a career necessarily involved. The creatures he studied and protected were among the most magnificent and dangerous in the magical world, requiring expertise that few witches or wizards possessed, and courage that went far beyond normal professional requirements. His decision to remain unmarried was made not from inability to form relationships, but from recognition that his lifestyle and commitments were incompatible with traditional family life, that the dragons he worked with demanded attention and presence that would be unfair to ask human partners to accept. The work was dangerous enough that he regularly faced the possibility of death or serious injury, making long-term planning difficult and emotional attachments potentially traumatic for those who cared about him. The letters he sent home were filled with stories of dragon behavior and habitat conservation that fascinated his nieces and nephews, introducing them to aspects of the magical world that most wizarding children never encountered, except in heavily censored textbooks. His occasional visits to Britain were eagerly anticipated events that brought exotic gifts and tales of adventure that expanded everyone's understanding of magical life beyond the relatively tame British Isles. His relationship with his nieces and nephews was particularly special, as he provided them with a model of adult life that prioritized passion and purpose over conventional markers of success, demonstrating that happiness could be found through dedication to causes larger than personal comfort or social acceptance. The children who grew up knowing Uncle Charlie understood that there were many ways to build meaningful lives, and that following one's calling might require sacrifices that others couldn't understand but were worth making. The expertise he had developed through years of working with some of the world's most dangerous magical creatures was occasionally called upon by the ministry for cases involving dragon smuggling, illegal breeding, or attacks on human populations. His testimony in legal proceedings and his consulting work with international magical cooperation agencies helped establish policies that balanced protection of dragon habitats with safety of wizarding communities that lived near dragon preserves. Bill Weasley's marriage to Fleur Delacour had survived the challenges of wartime separation and the trauma of his injuries during the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, their bond strengthened rather than weakened by adversity that might have destroyed less committed relationships. The scars that marked his face were permanent reminders of the prices paid for victory, but they were also symbols of survival and resilience that his children would grow up understanding as marks of honor rather than disfigurement. Their home at Shell Cottage became a gathering place for extended family and friends who needed refuge from the complexities of post-war life, a sanctuary where conversation could flow freely and guests could find both privacy and companionship as their needs required. The location near the sea provided peace and beauty that helped heal spirits wounded by war, while the isolation ensured that sensitive discussions could occur without fear of unwanted observation. The three children born to Bill and Fleur inherited both their parents' courage and their mixed magical heritage. The Veela influence from Fleur's maternal line combining with the Weasley family's natural magical ability to create young witches and wizards whose potential was extraordinary. Victoire, Dominique, and Louis would grow up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in French and English magical society, with opportunities for international careers that their parents' connections could facilitate. Victoire's early romantic attachment to Teddy Lupin created connections between families that had been forged in war but were being strengthened in peace. The children of heroes finding in each other the understanding and acceptance that came from shared experiences of growing up in the shadows of legendary parents. Their relationship would be watched with interest and approval by adults who recognized that such bonds helped ensure that the lessons of the past would be preserved for future generations. Louis's position as the only known male in magical Britain with Veela heritage made him unique in ways that would influence his development as he grew older and learned to navigate social dynamics that included both admiration and prejudice. His parents' guidance would be crucial in helping him understand that unusual gifts carried responsibilities to use them wisely and compassionately rather than for personal advantage or manipulation. Bill's continued work as a curse breaker for Gringotts took him occasionally to Egypt and other locations where ancient magic had been preserved in tombs and temples that required specialized knowledge to explore safely, but he was careful to limit his travel so that he could be present for his children's development and his wife's needs. The balance between professional fulfillment and family responsibility required constant adjustment, but it was a challenge that he embraced rather than resented. Fleur's adjustment to British magical society had been complicated by cultural differences and social prejudices that viewed her Veela heritage with mixture of fascination and suspicion, but her courage during the war and her contributions to the Order of the Phoenix had earned respect that transcended initial misconceptions about her character and abilities. The medals she received from the French Ministry of Magic honored service that had required her to choose between personal safety and moral duty, recognition that her adopted country appreciated even if it had been slow to accept her fully. The extended family gatherings that brought all the Weasley children and their own families together were exercises in organized chaos that required patience, flexibility, and enormous quantities of food to manage successfully. The children who played together during these events were learning lessons about loyalty, acceptance, and mutual support that would influence their own relationships throughout their lives. Understanding that family was both biological connection and conscious choice to remain committed to each other's welfare. The legacy that Arthur and Molly had created through their parenting was evident in the adults their children had become and the families they were building in turn, each generation learning from the previous, while adapting to changed circumstances and new challenges. The values of courage, loyalty, and love that had been instilled during childhood were being passed on to grandchildren, who would never know the fear and uncertainty that had marked their parents' adolescence, but who would carry forward the strength and wisdom that such trials had developed. The joke shop that had started as Fred and George's rebellion against conventional expectations had become symbol of resilience and renewal, proof that creativity and laughter could survive even the worst that evil could inflict. That joy was not frivolous luxury, but essential component of human flourishing that deserved protection and cultivation. The success of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes represented more than business achievement but cultural victory, demonstration that the values the family had always championed were not just admirable ideals, but practical approaches to building lives worth living. The empty space that Fred's death had left in the family constellation was acknowledged but not allowed to define their future, his memory honored through continued commitment to the principles he had embodied during his short but influential life. The laughter that echoed through family gatherings included recognition that some voices were missing, but it also celebrated the ongoing presence of love that death could not diminish and bonds that tragedy could not break. The dance of grief and joy that marked their healing was complex but ultimately hopeful, pointing toward futures that honored the past while embracing possibilities that remained to be discovered and explored. The ancient stones of Hogwarts had witnessed centuries of transformation, but perhaps none so profound as the healing that began in the months following the battle that had nearly destroyed the castle and claimed so many of its defenders. In the great halls where students had once cowered under the Carrow's cruelty, laughter began to echo again, tentative at first, but growing stronger with each passing day as the school community rebuilt, not just the physical damage, but the trust and wonder that made magical education possible. Minerva McGonagall stood in the rebuilt Great Hall, watching the first post-war feast unfold, with emotions that she had learned to manage, but never entirely suppress. The students who filled the long tables were a mixture of those who had lived through the occupation and newcomers who knew the recent darkness only through stories, their faces reflecting both the resilience of youth and the particular gravity that came from understanding how fragile peace could be. Her appointment as headmistress had been unanimous among the Board of Governors, a recognition not just of her qualifications and experience, but of the moral authority she had earned through her resistance to tyranny and her protection of students, when protection meant risking everything she had built over decades of service. The position brought responsibilities that extended far beyond educational administration to encompass healing, reconciliation, and the careful reconstruction of institutions that had been corrupted by evil, but whose essential purposes remained valid and necessary. The Order of Merlin, First Class, that she received for her wartime service, was displayed not in her office, but in a corner where it could be seen by visitors without dominating the space. A reminder of sacrifices made, but not a monument to personal glory. The chocolate frog card that bore her likeness was perhaps more meaningful, as it represented recognition from the broader magical community, and would introduce her to generations of children who needed to understand that authority could be exercised with both firmness and compassion. Her first year as headmistress was defined by decisions that balanced justice with mercy, tradition with necessary change, healing with accountability. The students who returned to complete educations that had been interrupted by war needed more than academic instruction but emotional support and practical guidance about how to process experiences that adults twice their age would have struggled to understand. The curriculum was quietly modified to include more emphasis on healing magic, conflict resolution, and the ethical use of power, lessons that had always been implicit in magical education, but now needed to be addressed directly. The decision to allow students like Hermione Granger and Dean Thomas to return for an additional year was both practical necessity and symbolic gesture, acknowledgement that education interrupted by circumstances beyond student control deserved completion regardless of age or previous achievement. The castle that had once enforced rigid separation between year groups adapted to accommodate students whose experiences had matured them beyond their chronological peers, but who still needed formal instruction to reach their full potential. The staff meeting where she announced the end of the defense against the dark arts curse was marked by collective relief that had been building for decades. As teacher after teacher had fallen victim to jinx that seemed unbreakable until Voldemort's death had freed the position from the malevolent magic that had claimed so many qualified instructors. The search for new professors who could provide stable, competent instruction in this crucial subject became one of her highest priorities. The memorial services held each anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts were carefully planned to honor the dead while celebrating the life and learning that their sacrifices had made possible. The ceremonies evolved over the years from raw expressions of grief to more complex observances that included gratitude, determination, and hope, reflecting the community's gradual processing of trauma into wisdom that could guide future choices and illuminate current challenges. Her own teaching load, which she maintained, despite administrative responsibilities, provided direct connection to the students whose lives she was helping to shape and protect. The transfiguration classes she continued to conduct became legendary among students not just for their academic rigor, but for the life lessons that emerged naturally from discussion of magical theory and practical application. The conversations she had with Portrait of Albus Dumbledore were private affairs that helped her process the enormous responsibilities of leadership, while drawing upon the wisdom of someone who had faced similar challenges under different but equally difficult circumstances. The advice she received was always thoughtful and usually helpful, though she had learned to trust her own judgment about when to follow guidance from the past and when to chart new courses that previous generations could not have anticipated. Rubeus Hagrid's continuation in his dual roles as Keeper of Keys and Grounds and Care of Magical Creatures Professor represented stability in a world where too much had changed too quickly, his presence a reminder that some good things could survive even the worst upheavals. The additional responsibility of bringing Hogwarts letters to Muggle-born students was a natural extension of his lifelong commitment to ensuring that no young witch or wizard was denied the education that could unlock their Respace's potential. The journey to Privet Drive to collect an 11-year-old Harry Potter had been the beginning of modern magical history, but Hagrid's continued visits to Muggle homes throughout Britain represented the ongoing miracle of discovery that marked each generation's introduction to the magical world. His gentle approach to explaining magical heritage to children and parents who had never imagined such possibilities was perfectly suited to bridging the gap between mundane and magical existence. The creatures he cared for in the Forbidden Forest and surrounding grounds were both dangerous and magnificent, requiring expertise that few possessed and courage that even fewer could sustain over decades of close contact with beings whose instincts and motivations operated according to non-human logic. His ability to see beauty and potential in creatures that others feared or dismissed was gift that he shared generously with students brave enough to look beyond surface appearances to understand deeper truths about magical life. The invitation he extended to Albus Potter for tea at his hut in 2017 was conscious echo of the hospitality he had shown to Harry almost 2 decades earlier, recognition that some traditions were worth preserving across generations, and that the children of heroes might need the same guidance and acceptance that their parents had received. The rock cakes and overstrong tea that he served were terrible by conventional standards, but perfect expressions of welcome and unconditional positive regard. His collection of magical creatures continued to grow and change as his reputation for successful rehabilitation spread throughout the magical world, bringing him animals that had been injured, orphaned, or deemed too dangerous for conventional care. The hippogriffs, thestrals, and various other beings that found sanctuary under his protection were testimonies to his belief that every magical life had value and potential for positive contribution to the world's richness and complexity. The vegetable garden he maintained behind his hut produced pumpkins of impossible size and other crops that challenged conventional understanding of agricultural magic. His success apparently based more on emotional connection to growing things than on formal training in botanical science. The meals he prepared from his harvest were shared generously with anyone who showed genuine interest in learning about the intersection between magic and nature. The legacy he was building through decades of patient work with successive generations of students was perhaps more important than any single dramatic gesture or heroic act, as thousands of young witches and wizards learned through his example that strength could be gentle, that power could be used to protect rather than dominate, and that the most dangerous creatures often proved to be the most rewarding to understand and befriend. Professor Flitwick's return to teaching charms was marked by renewed enthusiasm for magic that had been tested by war but emerged stronger rather than diminished. His tiny stature, concealing reserves of knowledge and power that had surprised even longtime colleagues during the Battle of Hogwarts. His dueling skills, demonstrated conclusively during the final confrontation with Death Eaters, had reminded everyone that academic expertise could be paired with formidable practical abilities when circumstances demanded action rather than theory. The Ravenclaw students who looked to him for guidance and inspiration found in him perfect embodiment of their house values. His intellectual curiosity, matched by creative application of magical principles that turned routine classroom instruction into explorations of possibility that engaged both mind and imagination. His lessons were famous throughout the school for their combination of rigorous academic standards and playful experimentation that encouraged students to push boundaries while respecting fundamental magical laws. The charms that he taught were not merely practical tools for making daily life easier, but expressions of magical artistry that connected students to centuries of accumulated wisdom and innovation. Each spell mastered was step toward understanding larger principles that governed magical reality, while each successful casting built confidence that would support more advanced work in later years of study. His continued service as head of Ravenclaw House required him to guide students whose intellectual gifts sometimes came with social awkwardness or emotional challenges that needed careful attention and patient support. The balance between challenging bright minds and nurturing developing personalities was delicate work that he had mastered through decades of observation and adjustment of his approaches to match individual needs and circumstances. Professor Sprout's leadership of the herbology department had been quietly revolutionary over the decades, transforming what many students viewed as mundane subject into exploration of magical life that connected to every other area of magical study and practical application. The greenhouses under her care were ecosystems of remarkable complexity and beauty, containing plants from every magical climate and soil condition, each specimen carefully chosen and maintained to provide both educational opportunities and practical resources. Her mentorship of Neville Longbottom represented one of her greatest professional satisfactions, as she watched a frightened child grow into a confident young man whose natural gifts in her subject had provided foundation for broader personal development and eventual career success. The process of nurturing his abilities while building his self-confidence had required patience and wisdom that drew upon her deepest understanding of how magical education should function when properly conducted. The retirement that she eventually chose was marked by complete confidence that her successor would maintain and improve upon the standards she had established. Understanding that institutional memory and accumulated expertise needed to be transferred carefully from one generation to the next. Her final lessons with Neville were as much about teaching philosophy and student psychology as about botanical science, preparation for responsibilities that extended far beyond technical competence. The portraits that began appearing in various parts of the castle represented attempts to preserve the wisdom and personalities of educators whose contributions had shaped the school's character and mission over generations of service. The magical paintings were more than mere decoration, but ongoing connections to institutional history that could provide guidance and perspective to current staff members facing challenges that might have precedence in previous eras. The house ghosts, who had witnessed centuries of Hogwarts history, became valuable resources for understanding how the school had weathered previous crises and adapted to changing circumstances, while maintaining its essential character and purpose. Nearly Headless Nick's cheerful presence in Gryffindor Tower provided continuity that helped students understand their connection to traditions that extended far beyond their individual experiences. The Fat Lady's portrait, guarding the entrance to Gryffindor Common Room, had been restored after her traumatic experience during Sirius Black's escape attempt, her confidence rebuilt through patient reassurance and enhanced security measures that acknowledged both her importance to house safety and her vulnerability to attack by those who meant harm to students under her protection. The Great Hall's restoration had preserved scars from the battle while removing damage that interfered with the space's function as gathering place and symbol of school unity, creating physical environment that honored sacrifice while supporting ongoing educational mission. The ceiling that reflected sky and weather continued to inspire wonder in new students, while reminding older ones that magic was both beautiful and powerful, capable of creating joy, as well as destruction depending upon the intentions and wisdom of those who wielded it. The library that Madame Pince had rebuilt was larger and more comprehensive than before, incorporating texts that had been hidden during the war, along with new acquisitions that reflected, expanded, understanding of subjects that had been restricted or forbidden under previous regimes. The expanded restricted section was more carefully regulated, but also more accessible to qualified students whose research required exposure to dangerous knowledge under proper supervision and guidance. The dormitories where students slept and studied had been rebuilt with enhanced privacy and security features that reflected hard-won understanding of how vulnerable young people could be when those responsible for their protection proved unworthy of trust. The common rooms where house identity was formed and friendship developed were designed to encourage both individual growth and collective loyalty, spaces where differences could be celebrated while shared values were reinforced. The grounds surrounding the castle had been restored to their previous beauty, while incorporating memorial gardens that provided quiet spaces for reflection and remembrance, places where the living could honor the dead while drawing strength for continued engagement with the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The ancient magic that protected the school had been renewed and strengthened, layers of defensive spells woven with blessing and hope rather than fear and desperation. The Forbidden Forest remained forbidden, but also continued to serve as classroom and laboratory for students brave enough to learn from its dangers and wise enough to respect its mysteries. Supervised exploration, replacing previous policies that had relied entirely on prohibition to keep young people safe from threats that education might enable them to understand and navigate successfully. The Quidditch pitch, where so many lessons about competition, teamwork, and grace under pressure had been learned, was restored to full operation. The sport once again providing outlet for energy and ambition, while teaching lessons about fair play and mutual respect that extended far beyond athletic achievement. The matches that resumed drew audiences from throughout the magical community. Celebrations of normalcy that marked successful transition from crisis to stability. The hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey continued her healing work, was expanded and modernized to reflect lessons learned about both magical and psychological wounds, incorporating understanding that some injuries required time and patience to heal completely, while others demanded immediate intervention to prevent permanent damage. The beds that had once held victims of various schoolboy mishaps now occasionally accommodated students struggling with aftermath of trauma that predated their arrival at school. The staff room, where teachers planned lessons and shared concerns, became center of ongoing professional development as educators worked together to understand how their subjects could contribute to broader goals of healing, growth, and preparation for citizenship in magical society that valued both individual achievement and collective responsibility. The conversations that occurred there were marked by mutual respect and shared commitment to serving students whose needs had been complicated by historical circumstances beyond anyone's control. The castle that emerged from this careful reconstruction was both familiar and transformed, honoring traditions that had proven their worthwhile, incorporating innovations that reflected hard-won wisdom about how magical education could serve broader purposes of personal development and social healing. The students who walked its corridors were inheriting institution that had been tested by evil and emerged stronger, more conscious of its mission, and more committed to fulfilling the promises that magical education made to every young witch or wizard who entered its doors, seeking knowledge, community, and preparation for adult responsibilities that would shape the future of their world. The scales of justice that had been tipped so violently toward darkness during Voldemort's reign required careful rebalancing in the months and years that followed his defeat, as the wizarding world struggled to determine how mercy and accountability could coexist in a society that had been torn apart by betrayal, coercion, and willing collaboration with evil. The trials that followed the war's end were conducted under intense scrutiny from a public that demanded both vengeance for suffering endured and assurance that such horrors could never be repeated through weakness disguised as compassion. Dolores Umbridge's arrest in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat was met with satisfaction that bordered on savage joy from those who had suffered under her peculiar brand of bureaucratic sadism, her pink-clad figure finally stripped of the authority she had wielded with such devastating effect against the innocent and defenseless. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable, documented through her own meticulous record-keeping and the testimonies of countless victims whose lives had been shattered by her systematic persecution. The charges brought against her encompassed not merely her collaboration with Death Eater policies, but her enthusiastic expansion and refinement of methods for identifying, prosecuting, and torturing Muggle-born witches and wizards whose only crime was the circumstances of their birth. The Muggle-born Registration Commission that she had administered with such evident pleasure was revealed to be machinery of genocide, designed to strip targeted populations of their rights, property, and eventually their lives through processes that maintained facades of legality while serving purely malevolent purposes. The trials of those accused of crimes against Muggle-born citizens were conducted with scrupulous attention to due process, understanding that justice compromised by procedural shortcuts or emotional excess would ultimately serve no one and might create precedents that future tyrants could exploit for their own purposes. The evidence was presented systematically, witness testimony was carefully verified, and defendants were provided with competent magical legal representation regardless of the heinous nature of their alleged crimes. Umbridge's defense attempted to portray her actions as reluctant compliance with superior authority, claiming that her personal beliefs were irrelevant to her professional obligations, and that resistance would have been both futile and dangerous to her own survival. The argument found little sympathy among judges who had access to extensive documentation of her initiative in expanding persecution beyond what had been specifically mandated, her obvious enjoyment of the suffering she inflicted, and her creation of new methods for inflicting psychological and physical torture upon her victims. The sentence of life imprisonment in Azkaban was delivered with grim satisfaction by Chief Warlock Kingsley Shacklebolt, who noted that while the Dementors were no longer present to inflict the soul-destroying torment that had characterized previous incarnations of the prison, the magical restraints and isolation that would mark her remaining years represented justice proportionate to the enormity of her crimes against innocent citizens who had trusted their government to protect rather than persecute them. The fate of various Death Eaters who had survived the final battle was determined through individual trials that examined not only their specific actions during both wars, but their levels of coercion, their opportunities for resistance, and their demonstrated attitudes toward reconciliation and reform. The process was complicated by the fact that many had been operating under Imperious Curse influence, magical compulsion that made traditional concepts of criminal responsibility difficult to apply fairly and consistently. Augustus Rookwood's trial focused particularly on his responsibility for Fred Weasley's death during the Battle of Hogwarts. Testimony from survivors, painting a picture of calculated cruelty that went beyond military necessity to encompass personal satisfaction in causing maximum pain and loss to his enemies. The evidence that he had specifically targeted the Weasley family out of spite rather than strategic consideration influenced the court's decision to impose life imprisonment without possibility of early release. Antonin Dolohhov's conviction for the murders of Remus Lupin and numerous other Order members was complicated by his claims that battlefield deaths should be treated differently from peacetime murders, an argument that the court rejected based on evidence that his killing methods had been designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve swift military objectives. The magical techniques he had developed for prolonging death while maintaining consciousness demonstrated sadistic creativity that exceeded the requirements of warfare and entered the realm of torture for its own sake. The trials of lower-level collaborators and those who had been peripherally involved in Death Eater activities required more nuanced approaches to justice, as courts attempted to distinguish between those who had actively chosen evil and those who had been swept along by circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The challenge was particularly acute in cases involving young people who had been raised in households where Death Eater ideology was presented as normal and correct. Their moral development, shaped by influences that they had been too immature to recognize as fundamentally wrong. Thickness's case represented the complex legal and ethical questions raised by Imperious Curse influence, as forensic examination confirmed that his actions as Minister for Magic had indeed been performed under magical compulsion that eliminated his conscious control over his decisions and behaviors. The court's decision to clear him of criminal responsibility while acknowledging the damage done during his tenure established important precedents for future cases involving magical mental manipulation. The capture and trial of remaining Death Eaters, who had evaded initial prosecution efforts, required extensive cooperation between ministry auras and international magical law enforcement agencies, as many fugitives had fled to countries with different extradition laws and varying attitudes toward British requests for assistance. The most dangerous escapees had gone into deep hiding, using resources accumulated during their criminal careers to establish new identities and create networks of support among sympathetic elements in foreign magical communities. Lucius Malfoy's cooperation with ministry authorities in locating and apprehending these fugitives was motivated partly by genuine desire to make amends for his past actions, but also by calculated self-interest in reducing his own legal exposure and protecting his family's remaining assets from additional forfeiture proceedings. The information he provided proved invaluable in dismantling several international networks that had been planning terrorist attacks and recruitment activities designed to continue Voldemort's work under different leadership. The intelligence gathering that preceded these arrests often required months of patient surveillance and careful infiltration of criminal organizations that had learned to be suspicious of outsiders and paranoid about ministry penetration of their activities. The auras who conducted these operations were often working in dangerous foreign territories without official diplomatic protection, their success dependent on skills developed during the war years and enhanced through specialized training in international magical law enforcement techniques. The trials that followed these arrests were conducted under international magical law protocols that required coordination between multiple governmental agencies and careful attention to sovereignty issues that could complicate prosecution efforts. The evidence had to meet standards that were acceptable to courts in different magical jurisdictions. Witness protection required cooperation from multiple agencies, and sentences had to be enforceable across national boundaries that were often poorly defined in magical law. The psychological examinations that were conducted on captured Death Eaters revealed disturbing patterns of moral development that had been shaped by exposure to dark magic from early ages, systematic indoctrination in supremacist ideologies, and participation in activities that had gradually eroded normal human empathy and moral reasoning. The findings influenced both sentencing decisions and recommendations for treatment programs that might eventually allow some offenders to be safely reintegrated into magical society. The impact of prolonged exposure to dark magic on mental and spiritual health became a subject of intense study among magical healers and legal experts who were trying to understand how previously normal individuals had been transformed into people capable of the most extreme forms of cruelty and violence. The research had implications not only for criminal justice policy, but for educational approaches that might prevent future generations from following similar paths toward moral corruption. The victims' rights movement that emerged from these trials demanded not only punishment for perpetrators, but also compensation for losses that could never be fully repaid and recognition of suffering that had been systematically ignored or minimized by previous administrations. The establishment of victim advocacy programs and memorial funds represented acknowledgement that justice required attention to those who had been harmed, as well as those who had caused harm. The families of those who had died fighting against Voldemort's forces were provided with pensions and other forms of support that recognized their sacrifices while attempting to address the practical needs of spouses and children who had been left without their primary sources of income and emotional support. The programs were designed to honor service while avoiding the creation of permanent dependency that might undermine recipients' dignity and long-term prospects for independence. The memorials that were erected throughout the magical world served not only to honor individual victims, but to educate future generations about the consequences of allowing prejudice and hatred to influence political and social policy. The exhibits included careful documentation of how democratic institutions could be corrupted from within, how legal systems could be manipulated to serve illegal purposes, and how ordinary citizens could become complicit in atrocities through passive acceptance of incremental changes in social norms. The educational programs that were developed to teach young witches and wizards about the recent conflict emphasized critical thinking skills and moral reasoning that would enable them to recognize and resist similar threats if they emerged in the future. The curriculum avoided simple narratives about good and evil in favor of more complex analyses of how institutional failures and individual choices had combined to create conditions that allowed extremist movements to gain power and influence. The international cooperation that developed around these justice efforts created new mechanisms for addressing magical crimes that crossed national boundaries and threatened the security of multiple magical communities simultaneously. The treaties and agreements that were negotiated established precedents for future collaboration while respecting the sovereignty concerns that had previously limited effective law enforcement cooperation between different magical governments. The professional development programs that were created for ministry employees emphasized ethical decision-making and resistance to corrupted authority, understanding that future threats to magical democracy were likely to emerge from within governmental institutions rather than through external conquest. The training covered recognition of gradual policy changes that might indicate systematic subversion of democratic norms and legal obligations of civil servants when ordered to implement policies that violated fundamental rights. The monitoring systems that were established to detect early signs of renewed Death Eater activity or similar extremist movements required delicate balance between public safety and privacy rights, understanding that excessive surveillance could itself become a threat to the democratic values that such systems were designed to protect. The oversight mechanisms included both governmental and civilian components to ensure that security measures remained accountable to elected officials and the broader magical community. The rehabilitation programs that were eventually developed for some categories of offenders emphasized education about the consequences of their actions and practical skills for constructive participation in magical society, understanding that indefinite imprisonment of all collaborators would create enormous financial burdens, while potentially generating additional grievances that future extremist movements could exploit for recruitment purposes. The success of these justice efforts was measured not only by the number of convictions obtained, but by the restoration of public confidence in magical governmental institutions and the establishment of precedents that would deter future attempts to subvert democratic processes through violence and intimidation. The ultimate goal was not merely punishment but prevention, creating conditions that would make future attempts at authoritarian control both more difficult to achieve and less attractive to potential supporters. The legacy of these trials extended far beyond the specific cases that were prosecuted to influence magical legal theory and practice for generations to come, establishing principles that balanced accountability with mercy, public safety with individual rights, and justice with reconciliation in ways that honored both those who had suffered and those who had sacrificed their lives to end the suffering of others. The careful attention to due process and proportional punishment demonstrated that democratic societies could respond to existential threats without abandoning the values that made them worth defending in the first place. The children who inherited the peace that had been purchased with such terrible cost carried within their young hearts both the blessing of safety and the weight of legacy, their lives shaped by stories of courage and sacrifice that they had been too young to witness, but old enough to understand had determined the very possibility of their existence. In nurseries where lullabies replaced the sounds of battle and playrooms where toys lay scattered instead of bodies, a new generation began to discover what it meant to grow up in a world where their greatest dangers were scraped knees and forgotten homework, rather than the prospect of sudden death or eternal enslavement. Edward Remus Lupin, known to all who loved him as Teddy, entered the world on a night when his parents still believed that tomorrow might bring victory, their hopes for his future mingling with desperate determination to ensure that such a future would exist for him to claim. The infant who would never hear his father's voice or feel his mother's arms around him was welcomed instead into a constellation of chosen family whose love proved that blood connections, while precious, were not the only bonds capable of sustaining life and nurturing growth toward adulthood. His grandmother Andromeda Tonks, who had already lost her husband Ted to Death Eater violence, found in her grandson both the echo of unbearable loss and the promise of renewed purpose. Her grief transformed into fierce protectiveness that would shield him from the knowledge of his orphaned state until he was old enough to understand that love came in many forms, and that absence, while painful, did not diminish the reality of parental devotion that had existed all too briefly but completely. Harry Potter's role as godfather was taken with the gravity of someone who understood what it meant to grow up without parents. His determination to provide guidance and support, informed by intimate knowledge of the questions that Teddy would eventually ask, and the longing for connection that no amount of substitute care could entirely satisfy. The relationship that developed between them was built on shared understanding of loss, but also on genuine affection that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with recognition of kindred spirits who had learned to find family wherever love was offered freely. The metamorph magus abilities that Teddy inherited from his mother manifested early and dramatically, his hair changing colors with his moods, and his features shifting to reflect the faces of those around him as he unconsciously mimicked the expressions of adults who delighted in his presence. The magical gift that had made Nymphadora so distinctive as an aura became in her son a source of endless entertainment and occasional concern, as he learned to control powers that could be used for deception as easily as for play. The relief that flooded through both sides of his family when it became clear that he had not inherited his father's lycanthropy was profound and complicated. Joy at his freedom from monthly transformation mingled with sorrow that Remus would never know that his greatest fear about fatherhood had proven groundless. The letters that Harry found among his godson's possessions years later revealed the depth of Lupin's terror that he might pass on the curse that had defined so much of his own experience, making normal relationships difficult and full acceptance by magical society nearly impossible. The household where Teddy grew to childhood was filled with photographs and stories that kept his parents' memory alive without making their absence the central fact of his existence. Careful balance maintained between honoring the dead and celebrating the living, between acknowledging loss and embracing possibility. Andromeda's wisdom as a grandmother was evident in her determination to speak about Remus and Nymphadora as real people with flaws and quirks, rather than saints whose perfection could never be matched by ordinary mortals. His integration into the extended Potter and Weasley families was so complete that visiting children often assumed he was a biological relative. His presence at holiday gatherings and summer outings, taken for granted by cousins who included him in their games and schemes, without pause for explanation or justification. The love that surrounded him was abundant and unquestioning, providing security that allowed him to explore his identity and abilities without fear of rejection or abandonment. The Hogwarts letter that arrived on his 11th birthday was celebrated throughout both families as a milestone that his parents would have treasured, their pride channeled through the adults who had taken responsibility for nurturing the potential that Remus and Nymphadora had glimpsed but never lived to see fully realized. The sorting ceremony that placed him in Hufflepuff was met with approval from those who understood that the house that valued loyalty and hard work was perfectly suited to someone whose character had been shaped by the steadfast devotion of multiple caregivers. His academic performance at Hogwarts reflected both natural intelligence and the strong work ethic that had been modeled by every adult in his life. His success earned through effort rather than assumed through privilege. His achievements celebrated without being treated as validation of his worth as a person. The teachers who had known his parents saw echoes of both in his personality and approach to learning. Remus's scholarly dedication combined with Nymphadora's irreverent humor and refusal to take authority too seriously. The relationship that developed between Teddy and Victoire Weasley was observed with interest and approval by families who recognized the natural compatibility between two young people who had grown up understanding that love created family bonds that were as strong as any biological connection. Their romance unfolded gradually from childhood friendship through adolescent attraction to mature partnership, watched over by adults who remembered their own young loves and hoped that this next generation might find happiness that had been denied to so many of their predecessors. The position of head boy that he achieved in his final year at Hogwarts was recognition not only of his academic abilities, but of the leadership qualities and moral character that had been nurtured through years of being surrounded by examples of service and sacrifice. His appointment celebrated by a extended family that understood the significance of such recognition from teachers who had known many exceptional students. James Sirius Potter entered the world carrying names that connected him to both heroic sacrifice and mischievous creativity. His inheritance, including not only his father's fame, but also the expectation that he would somehow live up to legacies that were both inspiring and potentially overwhelming for someone whose greatest achievement so far was learning to walk without falling down. The child who bore the names of his grandfather and Sirius Black grew into his identity gradually, displaying personality traits that suggested he had inherited the best qualities of both namesakes while developing characteristics that were uniquely his own. His magical abilities manifested early and dramatically, accidental magic that was more powerful than typical childhood outbursts and more controlled than might be expected from someone so young, suggesting potential that would require careful guidance to develop constructively rather than destructively. The flying lessons that began almost as soon as he could walk were natural extension of family tradition, but his aptitude exceeded even optimistic parental expectations and created possibilities for future Quidditch excellence if his interests developed in that direction. The attention that followed him wherever he went was managed carefully by parents who understood the burden of unwanted publicity and were determined to provide their son with as much normalcy as possible despite circumstances that made complete privacy impossible. The strategies that Harry and Ginny employed drew upon their own experiences with media scrutiny, creating boundaries that protected family time, while acknowledging public interest that was both inevitable and not entirely unwelcome. His relationship with his younger siblings was marked by protective instincts that emerged early and remained consistent throughout his childhood. His role as eldest child accepted with seriousness that sometimes surprised adults who expected more typical sibling rivalry and competition. The responsibility that he felt for Albus and Lily was encouraged but not exploited. His parents' understanding that birth order created natural leadership opportunities that should be nurtured without becoming burdensome. Albus Severus Potter's names carried even more complex historical weight than his brothers, connecting him to two men whose relationships with his father had been marked by misunderstanding, conflict, and eventual recognition of shared commitment to protecting others regardless of personal cost. The child who would eventually attend Hogwarts knowing that he represented reconciliation between former enemies grew into his identity with thoughtfulness that reflected both the complexity of his inheritance and the guidance of parents, who were determined to help him understand that names were gifts rather than chains. His personality was more introspective than his brother's, suggesting intellectual depth and emotional sensitivity that might serve him well in whatever career he eventually chose, but would also require careful support during adolescent years, when such qualities could become sources of isolation rather than strength. The conversations he had with his father about the men whose names he carried were conducted with age-appropriate honesty that helped him understand both their achievements and their failures as human beings, rather than legendary figures. The pressure that he felt to live up to his namesake's examples was acknowledged and discussed openly, his parents working to ensure that he understood that honor came from choosing to act with courage and compassion rather than from achieving specific accomplishments that others might consider impressive. The freedom to develop his own interests and values was protected carefully. His individual personality, celebrated rather than compared constantly to family legends. Lily Luna Potter brought light and joy to a family that had known too much darkness, her laughter echoing through rooms where serious conversations about war and loss sometimes cast shadows that her presence could dispel with remarkable effectiveness. The child who carried her grandmother's name and Luna Lovegoods grew into personality that combined fierce intelligence with gentle wisdom, approaching the world with curiosity that was both fearless and thoughtful. Her magical development followed patterns that were familiar to her parents, but surprising in their intensity. Early displays of power that suggested she had inherited significant abilities from both sides of her family tree. The training that she received was designed to help her understand magic as a tool for creating beauty and solving problems rather than weapon for dominating others. Lessons that drew upon generations of accumulated wisdom about how power should be exercised responsibly. The extended family gatherings that marked holidays and special occasions provided all the Potter children with understanding of their place in larger network of relationships that had been forged through shared struggle and maintained through conscious choice to remain connected despite busy schedules and divergent interests. The cousins who played together during these events were learning lessons about loyalty and mutual support that would influence their relationships throughout their lives. Rose Granger Weasley inherited her mother's intellectual gifts and her father's warm heart, approaching challenges with systematic analysis that was tempered by intuitive understanding of human nature and emotional dynamics. The child who bore names from both sides of her family tree grew into someone who could navigate complex social situations while maintaining strong personal principles, diplomatic skills that suggested future success in whatever field eventually captured her serious attention. Her academic achievements were celebrated but never treated as her primary source of worth, her parents working to ensure that she understood that intelligence was gift to be used in service of others, rather than tool for personal advancement at the expense of less gifted individuals. The balance between encouraging excellence and preventing arrogance required careful attention from adults who had themselves struggled with similar challenges during their own educational experiences. Hugo Granger Weasley displayed personality traits that suggested he had inherited the best qualities of both parents while avoiding some of their more challenging characteristics. His approach to life marked by confidence that was earned rather than assumed, and ambition that was directed toward worthy goals rather than mere personal aggrandizement. The younger child in a family marked by high achievement learned early that success came in many forms, and that contribution to family and community could be more important than individual recognition. The Weasley cousins who gathered for family celebrations created bonds that would sustain them through whatever challenges their adult lives might bring. their shared experiences of growing up in the aftermath of war, providing them with perspectives that their parents hoped would prevent future conflicts while preparing them to handle whatever difficulties emerged from changing circumstances in the magical world. Victoire Weasley's Vila heritage manifested in ways that were both blessing and complication, her unusual beauty drawing attention that was not always welcome, while her magical abilities developed along patterns that required specialized understanding and careful guidance from parents who were still learning about their prime daughter's unique needs and potential. The eldest child of Bill and Fleur grew into someone who used her gifts responsibly, understanding that power and beauty could be tools for good or ill, depending upon the character of the person who wielded them. Her relationship with Teddy Lupin was observed with approval by families who recognized genuine affection and compatibility between two young people who had grown up understanding that love created family bonds as strong as any biological connection. Their romance provided hope that the next generation might find happiness that had been denied to so many of their parents' contemporaries, relationships built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than mere attraction or convenience. Dominique and Louis Weasley completed the trio of children who inherited mixed magical heritage that connected them to both British and French magical traditions. Their bilingual upbringing and bicultural education, providing them with perspectives and opportunities that would serve them well in increasingly international magical community. The younger children learned from their sisters' experiences while developing their own approaches to managing the attention and expectations that came with their unusual ancestry. The network of relationships that connected all these children to each other and to the adults who had survived the war created support systems that would sustain them through whatever challenges their futures might hold, understanding that they were inheriting a world that was better than the one their parents had known as children, but still imperfect, and requiring continued effort to maintain and improve. The stories they heard about the war were carefully chosen and age-appropriately presented, designed to help them understand the importance of courage and sacrifice without traumatizing them with details that were too graphic or complex for young minds to process safely. The balance between honoring the past and protecting innocence required wisdom and judgment that drew upon the accumulated experience of adults who had themselves been children during times of danger and uncertainty. The magical education that awaited them at Hogwarts would be conducted in building that had been restored and reformed. But the lessons they learned there would build upon foundations that had been laid in homes where love was abundant and example was consistent, where service to others was valued above personal achievement, and where the bonds of family and friendship were celebrated as sources of strength rather than taken for granted as automatic entitlements. The future that stretched before them was bright with possibility, but not without challenges. As each generation discovered that the work of building just and peaceful society was never complete, always requiring renewal through conscious choice and active commitment to values that had to be taught and practiced, rather than simply inherited through accident of birth or circumstance of timing. The pathways that careers carved through the post-war wizarding world were as varied as the individuals who walked them, each person discovering that talents forged in crisis could be channeled toward purposes that served both personal fulfillment and collective healing, while others found that peacetime demanded entirely new skills and perspectives that their wartime experiences had not prepared them to develop. In the gradual restoration of normal life that followed Voldemort's defeat, some souls flourished in ways that surprised even those who knew them best, while others struggled to find meaning and direction in a world where their particular gifts were no longer desperately needed. Oliver Wood's devotion to Quidditch had never wavered even during the darkest years of the war, his understanding of the sport's tactical complexities, and his ability to inspire teammates through personal example, making him valuable both as player and eventual leader of professional teams. whose success depended as much on psychological preparation as physical conditioning. The transition from Hogwarts captain to reserve teamkeeper for Puddlemere United was marked by the same meticulous attention to detail and relentless pursuit of excellence that had characterized his approach to student athletics. Though the professional environment demanded adaptations that tested his flexibility as well as his fundamental skills, the reserve team position was both opportunity and trial, providing him with access to high-level training and coaching, while requiring him to demonstrate patience and persistence that went beyond what amateur competition had ever demanded. The players who surrounded him brought years of experience and levels of natural ability that challenged his own capabilities, forcing him to refine techniques and develop new approaches to the mental aspects of goalkeeping that separated competent players from truly exceptional ones. His participation in the Battle of Hogwarts had been motivated by loyalty to the school that had shaped his character and provided him with his first opportunities to excel. But the experience of helping to move bodies of fallen defenders left psychological marks that influenced his approach to competition in subtle but lasting ways. The understanding that games, however important they seemed to participants and spectators, were still just games compared to matters of life and death provided perspective that helped him maintain emotional balance during the pressures of professional athletics. The career that developed from these foundations was marked by steady advancement through increasingly prestigious teams and positions, his reputation for reliability and leadership eventually earning him opportunities that his younger self could barely have imagined. The goalkeeping techniques he refined and the training methods he developed were studied and adapted by coaches throughout the magical world. His influence on the sport extending far beyond his individual achievements as a player. Victor Krum's return to international Quidditch competition was driven by determination to prove that his performance in the Triwizard Tournament and his brief relationship with Hermione Granger had not defined the limits of his branger potential. His athletic career, resuming with intensity that reflected both natural competitive spirit and conscious effort to move beyond associations that had overshadowed his considerable accomplishments as a seeker. The years that followed were marked by performances that exceeded even his previous standards, demonstrating that maturity and experience could enhance rather than diminish the reflexes and intuition that had made him famous throughout the magical world. The 8 years he spent playing professional Quidditch were characterized by consistent excellence that established him as one of the greatest seekers in the history of the sport, his statistics and achievements creating records that would challenge future generations of players, while inspiring young athletes who saw in his career proof that dedication and intelligent training could overcome almost any obstacle or limitation. The World Cup appearance that had eluded him during his initial rise to prominence finally materialized when he was older and presumably past his athletic prime, the irony not lost on commentators who had written premature obituaries for his competitive career. The match itself was a masterpiece of tactical Quidditch, with both teams employing strategies that had been refined through decades of international competition. Every play calculated to exploit weaknesses while minimizing exposure to counterattacks. The moment when he caught the snitch was captured by magical photographers whose images would be studied and celebrated for generations. The expression on his face revealing the depth of satisfaction that came from achieving goals that had seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing year. The tears that followed were witnessed by millions of spectators who understood that they were seeing not just athletic triumph but personal vindication, proof that perseverance could overcome disappointment, and that dreams deferred were not necessarily dreams denied. The retirement that followed this pinnacle achievement was planned and executed with the same intelligence that had characterized his playing career, his decision to step away from competition while at the height of his powers, reflecting understanding that some endings were more meaningful than others. The farewell tour that preceded his final departure from professional Quidditch was marked by demonstrations of respect from opponents and fans that testified to the character he had displayed throughout his career. The return to competition for the 2014 season was announced with minimal fanfare. His explanation that he wanted to win the World Cup before he died, suggesting both humor and genuine recognition that opportunities for such achievements were limited by biology and circumstance. The team that welcomed him back understood that they were receiving not just a skilled player, but a leader whose experience and perspective could elevate the performance of younger teammates who had never competed at the highest levels. The World Cup victory that culminated this final phase of his career was sweeter for having been delayed. The trophy that he held above his head, representing not just team achievement, but personal journey that had included setbacks and discouragements, that had tested his commitment to goals that sometimes seemed impossible to reach. The photograph of him crying while clutching the snitch became an iconic image that inspired countless young athletes to persist through their own difficulties and disappointments. Cho Chang's post-war life unfolded away from the public attention that had marked her Hogwarts years. Her marriage to a Muggle man representing conscious choice to build relationships based on personal compatibility rather than shared magical heritage or social expectations. The happiness that she found in this partnership was evident to those who knew her well, her contentment reflecting successful transition from the traumatic experiences of her youth to the peaceful domesticity that she had chosen over more dramatic alternatives. The integration of magical and non-magical elements in her household required careful navigation of practical and emotional challenges that few couples had to address. But the solutions she and her husband developed became models for other mixed marriages that were becoming increasingly common in the post-war wizarding world. The children who grew up in homes where magic was present but not dominant learned to appreciate both traditions while feeling equally comfortable in either environment. Her decision to maintain privacy about the details of her personal life was respected by former classmates and teachers who understood that some forms of happiness required protection from public scrutiny, the quiet contentment she had found being more fragile than the dramatic romance and adventure that captured media attention. The reunions she attended and the friendships she maintained provided connections to her magical heritage without compromising the peaceful life she had built with someone who loved her for qualities that had nothing to do with her ability to cast spells or her experiences during the war. Rita Skeeter's post-war career represented continuation of journalistic practices that had been refined during decades of sensational reporting. Her approach to biographical writing combining minimal research with maximum speculation in ways that generated both controversy and sales. The subjects she chose for her unauthorized biographies were selected based on their potential to attract readers rather than their historical significance or the availability of reliable source material, her methods remaining consistent despite criticism from those who valued accuracy over entertainment. The biography of Harry Potter that she produced in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat was typical of her work, containing enough factual information to seem credible, while including enough fabrication and distortion to create narrative drama that pure truth might have lacked. The 25% accuracy rate that was eventually established through careful fact-checking reflected both her disregard for journalistic ethics and her skill at weaving plausible fiction around kernels of verified reality. Her coverage of Severus Snape's posthumous reputation attempted to capitalize on public fascination with his complex legacy. The book titled Snape, Scoundrel, or Saint promising definitive answers to questions that were more interesting when left unresolved. The research she conducted was superficial and often misleading, her interviews with supposed sources producing quotes that supported predetermined conclusions rather than revealing new insights about his character or motivations. The 2014 Quidditch World Cup provided her with opportunities to practice the kind of disruptive reporting that had made her notorious throughout her career. Her articles during the tournament, creating conflicts between players and managers, through deliberate misrepresentation and inflammatory speculation that prioritized dramatic impact over truthful coverage. The corrections that Ginny Potter provided during their joint coverage were swift and devastating, demonstrating how professional journalism should respond to colleagues who violated basic standards of accuracy and fairness. The mysterious illness that struck Rita during the final match was attributed by some to natural consequences of stress and overwork, though those familiar with Ginny's repertoire of hexes suspected more targeted intervention designed to prevent additional damage to reputations and relationships that Rita's reporting threatened to destroy through careless disregard for truth and human dignity. Her final book about Newt Scamander represented the culmination of a career built on exploitation of others' achievements and reputations. The title, Man or Monster? The Truth About Newt Scamander, suggesting sensational revelations that the content failed to deliver. The fabricated claims about his personal relationships and professional conduct were so obviously false that even her most loyal readers began to question the reliability of her previous works. Her credibility finally damaged beyond repair by overreach that exceeded even her considerable capacity for deception. The response that Newt himself provided through his own authorized memoir demonstrated how subjects of unauthorized biographies could defend themselves effectively when they possessed both credible evidence and platforms for reaching the public directly. His calm refutation of her most outrageous claims, supported by documented proof and testimony from credible witnesses, made her work appear not just inaccurate, but maliciously dishonest, in ways that even her supporters found difficult to defend. Gilderoy Lockhart's permanent residence at Street Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries was marked by gradual acceptance of limitations that his previous personality would never have acknowledged, the memory damage that had ended his career as fraudulent celebrity, creating opportunities for genuine happiness that his earlier life had not provided. The man who had built his reputation on lies discovered that truth, however modest, was more satisfying than elaborate deceptions that required constant maintenance and eventual exposure. The autobiography he produced with assistance from hospital staff was titled, Who Am I? In recognition of his genuine confusion about his identity and history, the book becoming unexpected success among readers who appreciated honest acknowledgement of vulnerability and limitation. The public response suggested that authenticity, even when accompanied by obvious deficits, was more compelling than the polished perfection he had previously attempted to project. His continued signing of autographs for fans who wrote to him was performed without understanding of why such attention was directed toward him, but the pleasure he took in the activity was genuine and touching to those who remembered his previous arrogance and self-promotion. The gradual recovery of some memories was celebrated by medical staff who had grown fond of their patient, though his personality remained fundamentally changed by the trauma he had suffered. The happiness that marked his later years was noted by healers who had treated many patients with similar injuries, his contentment suggesting that some forms of brain damage could paradoxically improve quality of life by eliminating sources of anxiety and dissatisfaction that had previously caused suffering. The man who had been miserable while famous discovered peace in anonymity and simplicity that his uninjured mind had been incapable of appreciating. Gregory Goyle's survival of the Battle of Hogwarts was followed by gradual recognition that his long-time association with Draco Malfoy had been based more on habit and convenience than genuine friendship or shared values. The relationship dissolving naturally as both young men moved toward different approaches to adult life and responsibility. The process of developing independent identity and judgment was challenging for someone who had spent years following others' lead, but it was also liberating in ways that he had never experienced during his school years. The career path he eventually chose reflected interests and abilities that had been suppressed or ignored during his time as Malfoy's follower, his natural talents finally receiving attention and development that allowed him to contribute meaningfully to magical society, rather than simply occupying space and consuming resources. The respect he earned through competent work and decent behavior was more satisfying than the fear and deference his previous associations had generated. Pansy Parkinson's decision to sever ties with the Malfoy family was motivated by recognition that their reduced social status made association with them more liability than asset, but it also reflected genuine growth in her understanding of values and priorities that extended beyond mere social climbing and status preservation. The relationships she built in place of her previous connections were based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than calculated advantage and inherited prejudice. The career she developed drew upon intelligence and organizational skills that had been evident during her school years, but had been channeled primarily toward maintaining social hierarchies and excluding those deemed unworthy of acceptance. Her adult work served more constructive purposes while still utilizing her natural talents for analysis and coordination, demonstrating that abilities developed in service of harmful goals could be redirected toward beneficial outcomes. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan's return to Hogwarts for their delayed 7th year was marked by shared determination to complete educations that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control, their friendship providing mutual support during readjustment to academic life after months of uncertainty and danger. The experience of returning to familiar surroundings that held memories of both normal teenage concerns and life-threatening peril required psychological adaptation that their teachers and classmates tried to support through patience and understanding. Their academic performance during this final year reflected both maturity gained through extraordinary experiences and gaps in formal education that had to be addressed through additional study and remedial work. The balance between catching up on missed material and processing trauma that had affected their ability to concentrate required careful attention from professors who were themselves still recovering from the war's impact on their professional and personal lives. The friendships they maintained with classmates who had not shared their particular wartime experiences were enriched rather than complicated by the different perspectives they brought to discussions of current events and future plans, their insights helping others understand aspects of the conflict that had been hidden from those who had remained in school throughout the occupation. The chocolate frog cards that eventually honored various war heroes represented recognition that heroism took many forms and that the contributions of ordinary people who had chosen courage over safety deserved commemoration alongside the Resigos on.com, achievements of those whose names had become legendary. The images that appeared on these cards were selected to represent not just individual accomplishments, but collective effort that had made victory possible through countless acts of bravery and sacrifice. The distribution of these honors among people from different backgrounds and with varying levels of public recognition demonstrated that the wizarding world was learning to appreciate diversity of contribution and to understand that leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses from ordinary citizens. The careers that flourished in the post-war era reflected both individual talents and collective needs for reconstruction and renewal, as society sought to rebuild institutions while avoiding the mistakes that had made previous disasters possible. The balance between honoring tradition and embracing necessary change required wisdom and flexibility from leaders who understood that progress could not be achieved through wholesale rejection of the past, but had to be built upon foundations that had proven their worthwhile, eliminating elements that had enabled corruption and abuse. The magical creatures that inhabited the shadows and forgotten corners of the wizarding world had witnessed the rise and fall of dark powers with the patient wisdom that came from lifespans that measured change across centuries rather than décades, their responses to the war's aftermath, reflecting both ancient understanding of how conflicts affected the delicate balance between magical and mundane existence, and immediate needs for healing that transcended the boundaries between species that wizarding lore had established through generations of incomplete comprehension. Creature's service in the final battle had transformed him from reluctant and bitter house elf, whose loyalty had been corrupted by years of neglect and abuse, into willing participant in the struggle against forces that threatened everything he had been created to protect. His small but significant contributions to victory, earning him recognition and respect that no previous generation of his kind had experienced from their magical human masters. The years that followed at Hogwarts were marked by dignity and purpose that had been denied to him throughout most of his extraordinarily long life. His work in the kitchens, conducted alongside free house elves who had chosen their service rather than being bound to it through magical compulsion and family obligation. The respect that students and staff showed him was genuine rather than condescending, based on understanding of his personal history and appreciation for sacrifices he had made rather than mere acknowledgement of his species' traditional role in magical households. His relationship with Harry Potter, which had evolved from mutual hostility through grudging cooperation to something approaching friendship, provided him with experiences of human interaction that had been impossible during his decades of service to the Black family. The conversations they shared revealed depths of personality and intelligence that pure-blood supremacists had always denied existed in house elves, challenging assumptions that had justified centuries of exploitation and casual cruelty. The stories he told to younger elves about his experiences during the war became legendary in the Hogwarts kitchens, teaching lessons about courage and dignity that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of his own choices. His insistence that house elves could be both loyal servants and independent moral agents influenced a generation of his kind who would approach their relationships with wizarding families differently than their ancestors had done. His death in 2017 at the remarkable age of 666 was mourned throughout the castle community, his funeral attended by students and staff who understood that they were saying farewell to someone whose life had bridged historical eras and whose service had embodied the best possibilities for cooperation between magical species. The memorial that was erected in his honor was modest but permanent, acknowledging contributions that had been essential even when they were not publicly celebrated. The timing of his death, coming exactly at an age that suggested either remarkable coincidence or subtle magical influence, was noted by those familiar with the symbolic significance that numbers held in magical theory and practice. His passing marked the end of direct connections to the Black family's darkest period, while opening possibilities for future relationships between house elves and wizards that were based on mutual respect rather than traditional servitude. Winky's recovery from the alcoholism that had nearly destroyed her in the aftermath of Barty Crouch Sr.'s death was slow and difficult, requiring years of patient support from other house elves and gradual rebuilding of self-worth that had been shattered by dismissal from service that had defined her entire identity. The healing process was complicated by magical physiology that made house elves particularly vulnerable to substances that provided temporary escape from emotional pain, but created dependencies that were harder to break than similar addictions in human populations. The work she found at Hogwarts provided structure and purpose that were essential for maintaining sobriety, while allowing her to contribute meaningfully to magical society, rather than simply existing as burden or object of pity. Her participation in the final battle, fighting alongside wizards who had once viewed her kind as property rather than allies, marked a crucial turning point in her understanding of her own worth and potential for independent moral action. The kitchen duties that occupied her days were performed with meticulous attention to detail that reflected both natural house elf perfectionism and conscious choice to prove that she deserved the trust and respect that had been offered to her despite her previous struggles. The younger elves who worked alongside her learned from her example that recovery from trauma and addiction was possible, but required daily commitment to choices that sometimes seemed more difficult than the problems they were designed to solve. Her occasional lapses into drinking were handled with compassion rather than judgment by colleagues who understood that healing was process rather than destination, that setbacks were part of recovery rather than evidence of failure. The support system that developed around her demonstrated how magical communities could care for vulnerable members without enabling destructive behaviors or compromising their own well-being. The letters she sometimes wrote to Harry Potter and Hermione Granger expressed gratitude for kindnesses that had been shown to her during the darkest period of her life, though she was careful never to burden them with requests for additional help or sympathy. The independence she had learned to value was balanced with appreciation for connections that had made her survival and recovery possible. The house elves' collective participation in the Battle of Hogwarts had been unprecedented in magical history, representing conscious choice by an entire species to risk everything in defense of principles that extended beyond their traditional obligations to individual families. The courage they had displayed in fighting alongside wizards challenged assumptions about their capabilities and desires that had justified centuries of servitude disguised as benevolent protection. The changes in working conditions and legal status that followed the war were gradual rather than revolutionary, reflecting both practical limitations on how quickly established systems could be reformed and resistance from traditional elements in wizarding society who preferred familiar arrangements to uncertain alternatives. The progress that was achieved came through persistent advocacy and demonstration that house elves could contribute more when they were treated as partners rather than property. Firenze's restoration to his herd represented healing of divisions that had been created by his choice to teach human students rather than maintaining the traditional separation between centaur and wizard societies. The other centaurs had eventually recognized that his willingness to share their knowledge with those outside their species reflected wisdom rather than betrayal, understanding that isolation had not protected them from the conflicts that threatened all magical beings regardless of their political affiliations. His continued teaching at Hogwarts while living in the Forbidden Forest represented compromise that satisfied both his professional obligations and his cultural identity, demonstrating that integration did not require abandonment of heritage or complete assimilation into human society. The schedule he maintained allowed him to contribute to magical education while participating fully in herd activities and maintaining connections to the natural world that were essential to centaur well-being. The students who learned divination from him gained perspectives on magical prophecy that were unavailable through purely human instruction, understanding that the future revealed itself through patterns that required both analytical intelligence and intuitive wisdom to interpret accurately. His teaching methods emphasized observation of natural cycles and celestial movements rather than reliance on crystal balls and tea leaves, approaches that produced more reliable results while maintaining connection to magical traditions that predated formal wizarding education. The respect that he earned from both human and centaur communities made him valuable intermediary when conflicts arose between species that had different approaches to magical knowledge and different relationships with non-magical authority. His diplomatic skills were tested repeatedly as the wizarding world struggled to develop policies that acknowledged centaur autonomy while addressing practical concerns about territorial boundaries and resource allocation. The foals that were born into his herd during the post-war years grew up with different attitudes toward human contact than previous generations had maintained. Their childhood experiences, including positive interactions with witch and wizard visitors who approached centaur territory with appropriate respect and genuine desire for cultural exchange rather than exploitation or domination. Grawp's residence in the areas surrounding Hogwarts had been formalized through agreements that recognized his right to live peacefully in the environment that had become his home while establishing boundaries that protected both him and the human communities that shared the region. The giant who had been rescued from abuse by his own kind found contentment in solitude that was occasionally interrupted by visits from his brother and friends who remembered his contributions to their victory. The caves and mountain territories that he claimed provided him with shelter and privacy, while allowing him sufficient space for movement and activity that his enormous size required. The magical protections that surrounded these areas, ensuring that unwanted intruders would be discouraged, without creating dangers for innocent travelers who might accidentally wander into his domain. His relationship with Hagrid continued to develop despite the practical difficulties that differences in size and lifestyle created, their bond based on mutual affection and shared experiences that transcended normal social boundaries. The gifts that Hagrid brought during his visits were chosen with careful attention to Grawp's interests and needs, demonstrating understanding that had grown through patient observation and genuine caring. The other giants who occasionally approached his territory were met with responses that ranged from cautious welcome to firm rejection, depending upon their intentions and their willingness to respect the peaceful existence he had chosen over the violence and conflict that characterized traditional giant society. His example influenced some members of his species to consider alternatives to the aggression and territorial disputes that had defined their culture for centuries. The magical creatures that lived in the Forbidden Forest adapted to his presence with varying degrees of success, some species relocating to avoid potential conflicts, while others discovered that his protection could be valuable against threats that their own defenses could not handle effectively. The ecosystem that developed around his residence was more complex and stable than might have been expected, demonstrating how apparently incompatible species could learn to coexist when circumstances encouraged cooperation rather than competition. Buckbeak's peaceful retirement at Hogwarts represented justice finally served to a creature who had been condemned to death for defending himself against unprovoked attack, his freedom restored through legal processes that acknowledged hippogriff rights while establishing precedents for future cases involving magical creature welfare. The years he spent in Hagrid's care were marked by contentment and dignity that had been threatened by political maneuvering and prejudice, but ultimately preserved through persistence and courage. His participation in care of magical creatures lessons provided students with opportunities to interact with hippogriff, culture, and psychology that textbooks could never convey, teaching lessons about respect and proper approach to beings whose pride and intelligence demanded recognition rather than casual treatment as exotic pets or dangerous obstacles. The students who learned to bow properly and wait for acceptance gained understanding that would serve them well in future encounters with magical creatures whose cooperation had to be earned rather than commanded. The flights that he occasionally took with trusted riders demonstrated the joy and freedom that had been restored to him after months of captivity and fear, his powerful wings carrying him over landscapes that he viewed with perspectives unavailable to earthbound observers. The trust required for such flights was mutual, based on recognition that both rider and mount were accepting vulnerability that could only be justified by complete confidence in each other's intentions and abilities. His age and experience made him a valuable teacher for younger hippogriffs who were brought to Hogwarts for educational purposes, his example demonstrating proper behavior toward humans while maintaining hippogriff dignity and independence. The relationships he formed with these younger creatures provided him with social connections that his solitary retirement might otherwise have lacked. Fawkes's departure from Hogwarts after Dumbledore's death was both expected and deeply sorrowful, the Phoenix's bond with his human companion having been so complete that survival in the same environment became impossible once that relationship had ended. The song he sang on the night of Dumbledore's death was heard throughout the castle, its haunting beauty providing comfort to those who were mourning while serving as farewell to the place that had been his home for decades. The search for him that various people conducted in the months following his disappearance was unsuccessful, but demonstrated the affection and concern that he had inspired in students and staff who had come to think of him as permanent feature of castle life. The empty perch in the headmaster's office remained undisturbed for years, silent testament to loyalty that had transcended normal relationships between humans and magical creatures. The legends that developed about his current location and activities provided comfort to those who preferred to believe that he had found new purpose rather than simply reverting to wild existence that might be solitary and without the place. Meaningful connections that had characterized his years of service. The occasional reports of Phoenix song heard in remote locations were investigated with hope, but never confirmed, leaving his fate as mystery that each person could interpret according to their own needs and beliefs. The magical significance of phoenixes in wizarding culture meant that his departure was viewed as symbol as well as personal loss, representing the end of an era and the beginning of uncertain future that would have to be navigated without the wisdom and protection that his presence had provided. The renewal that Phoenix mythology promised offered hope that his influence would continue even in his absence, but that hope was tempered by recognition that some losses created voids that could never be completely filled. The other magical creatures that inhabited the grounds and surrounding areas adjusted gradually to changes in the castle's population and purpose, their ancient connections to the magical energies that sustained Hogwarts remaining strong despite alterations in human leadership and priorities. The thestrals that were visible only to those who had witnessed death found increased acceptance among students whose wartime experiences had expanded their ability to perceive realities that had previously been hidden from them. The unicorns whose presence in the Forbidden Forest had always been considered blessing and protection continued to grace the area with their beauty and magic, though they remained selective about whom they would approach and under what circumstances such contact would be permitted. The respect that they commanded from all other magical beings served as a reminder that some forms of purity and power were too precious to be approached casually or without proper preparation and intent. The centaur herds that roamed the deeper parts of the forest maintained their traditional independence while demonstrating increased willingness to share knowledge and warnings when circumstances threatened the delicate balance that allowed multiple magical species to coexist in relative harmony. Their astronomical observations and interpretations provided early warnings of political and magical changes that could affect the entire magical community. The acromantulas, whose colony had been established in the darkest reaches of the forest, continued their existence according to patterns that had been established decades earlier, their population stable, but not expanding beyond the territories that had been allocated to them through formal and informal agreements with other forest inhabitants. The understanding that they were tolerated rather than welcomed was accepted with philosophical resignation that characterized their species' approach to relationships with beings they could not safely consume. The various smaller creatures that filled ecological niches throughout the magical ecosystem surrounding Hogwarts adapted to post-war changes with resilience that demonstrated how life persisted and flourished even after catastrophic disruptions to established patterns. The bowtruckles that guarded special trees, the Cornish pixies that created minor mischief in classroom settings, and the countless other magical beings that called the area home contributed to richness and complexity that made magical education more comprehensive and meaningful than any purely academic program could achieve. The understanding that magical creatures possessed intelligence, emotions, and rights that deserved recognition and protection had been advanced significantly by the war's aftermath, though progress toward full equality and integration remained slow and sometimes controversial. The examples provided by individual creatures who had chosen to ally themselves with forces of light during the conflict served as powerful arguments for policies that acknowledged their agency and valued their contributions to magical society. The memorial gardens that were established to honor all those who had died defending Hogwarts included recognition of non-human casualties, whose sacrifices had received less attention than human losses but had been equally significant in determining the war's outcome. The diversity of species represented in these commemorations reflected growing awareness that the magical world was community that extended far beyond human wizarding society to encompass all beings capable of moral choice and meaningful action. The twilight that settles over this chronicle of lives rebuilt and dreams fulfilled carries with it the gentle satisfaction of stories completed, of promises kept through sacrifice and dedication that transformed a world scarred by hatred into one enriched by hope. In the quiet corners where heroes learned to be ordinary people, and ordinary people discovered their capacity for extraordinary love, the seeds planted during the darkest hours had grown into gardens of possibility that would nurture generations yet to come. The children who played in gardens where battles had once raged carried within their laughter the echo of every choice that had preserved their right to innocence, their freedom to dream of futures unclouded by the shadows that had haunted their parents' youth. The schools where they learned and the homes where they grew were built upon foundations of courage that had been tested in fire and proven stronger than any force that evil could muster against it. The bonds that connected family to family, friend to friend, and stranger to stranger across the breadth of the magical world were woven from threads of shared understanding that peace was precious because it was fragile, that love was powerful because it demanded everything from those who chose to offer it freely. The quiet contentment that marked these golden years was earned through tears and blood and sleepless nights of vigilance, each moment of happiness paid for by someone who had chosen duty over comfort and others' welfare over personal safety. Sleep now, gentle dreamer, knowing that in the vast tapestry of stories we have shared tonight, every thread leads toward dawn.